They came at 7 in the morning. Three black SUVs rolled up to Ethan Holloway's repair shop like a funeral procession that forgot to slow down. Men in tailored suits stepped out holding folders, eyes flat and cold. Ethan was on his second cup of coffee, knuckles still dark with grease from the night before. One of them said he had exploited a vulnerable woman. Another said the word fraud, like he'd been saving it. Ethan set down his mug. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at them and said, "I changed a tire. You got the wrong man." If you've ever done something kind and had it used against you, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments and let me know how far this story has traveled. The rain started around 9 on a Tuesday night in late November, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, steady and indifferent, turning the highway into a black mirror that swallowed headlights whole. Ethan Holloway was already running late getting back to his shop. He'd spent the better part of the afternoon under the chassis of a 2009 Ford pickup owned by a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Garland, who paid him in installments and always brought him a Tupperware container of something home-cooked when she did. Tonight, it had been chicken and dumplings. The container was sitting on the passenger seat of his truck, still warm. He almost didn't see her. The car was a dark gray Mercedes pulled halfway onto the shoulder of Route 9, hazard lights blinking in the wet dark like a slow heartbeat. Ethan's first instinct, the one that comes from years of being exhausted and behind on bills, was to keep driving. It was 40 degrees out. He had a 7-year-old daughter, Maya, waiting at home with his neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, watching her. He was tired in the specific way that single fathers get tired, the kind that sits behind your eyes and doesn't fully go away even when you sleep. But he slowed down anyway. He pulled over 30 yards ahead and sat there for a second, engine running, windshield wipers cutting back and forth. Then he grabbed his jacket off the back seat and got out. The woman was crouched near the rear passenger tire, holding her phone up for light. She was wearing a long coat, dark, expensive-looking, even soaked through. Her hair was plastered to her face. The tire was completely flat, not slowly dying flat, but blown. The rubber peeled back and hanging off the rim in strips like something had exploded. "You need a hand?" Ethan called over the rain. She stood up fast, and for just a second he saw the flash of something cross her face, that quick instinctive fear that women learn early when a stranger approaches them on a dark road at night. He understood it. He stepped back a half step and kept his hands visible. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "My shop's about 4 miles back. I'm just trying to help." She studied him for a moment. He was 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, wearing a faded jacket with Holloway Auto stitched over the chest pocket. His face was the kind of face that had been tired for a while but hadn't gone mean from it. "I called roadside assistance 20 minutes ago," she said. Her voice was controlled, careful, like someone used to keeping things even. "They said 45 minutes minimum." "That tire's not drivable regardless," Ethan said, nodding toward it. "You got a spare?" She glanced toward the trunk. "I have no idea." "Pop it, and let's look." She hesitated, then reached into the car. The trunk unlocked with a soft thunk. Ethan walked back and lifted the cargo floor. There was a spare, compact, the temporary kind, nested in the foam well alongside a jack that looked like it had never been touched. "Okay," he said. "This'll take about 15 minutes." "You don't have to. I'm already wet," he said simply. He got to work. She stood nearby at first, then crouched back down to hold the phone light while he positioned the jack. Up close, without the rain making everything abstract, he noticed she was probably around 30, sharp-featured, with the particular kind of stillness that either means someone is very calm or working hard not to show that they aren't. "You do this a lot?" she asked. "Stop for strangers." "Not really," he admitted, cranking the jack handle. "I almost didn't tonight." "What made you stop?" He thought about that while he worked the first lug nut loose. "I don't know. Habit, I guess. My dad used to say if you drive past somebody in trouble and tell yourself someone else will stop, you're just hoping someone else is a better person than you." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thing to say." "He was a good guy." Ethan didn't elaborate. His father had been dead 11 years, and that was a whole separate story he didn't feel like opening in the rain on Route 9. He got the blown tire off and lifted the spare into place. His hands were cold enough now that he was losing some of the finer motor control in his fingers, fumbling slightly with the lug nuts. He didn't say anything about it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ethan. Ethan Holloway." "Claire," she said. Just the first name, no last name offered. "You live around here, Claire?" "Not exactly." A pause. "I was driving back from a meeting that went late." He nodded like that explained something and went back to tightening the lug nuts in the cross pattern his father had drilled into him at age 12. Opposite corners, even pressure, 3 passes. Do it right the first time or you do it twice. "This spare isn't made for highway speeds," he said when he was done, standing up and brushing wet grit off his knees. "Keep it under 50 and get to a tire shop tomorrow morning. Don't push it." "Okay." She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing." "I'm serious. What do you charge?" "I didn't charge you anything," he said. "It's 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. I changed a tire." "That's not a transaction." She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said, "At least let me—" "There's a cash—" "Claire." He said it gently but clearly. "I'm good. Drive safe." He started walking back toward his truck. Behind him, he heard her say something, quietly, almost to herself, but the rain took it before it reached him. He was almost at the driver's side door when he heard her footsteps on the wet asphalt. "Wait!" He turned. She was holding out her hand, and it took him a second to realize she wanted his business card. Not to give him one, but asking if he had one. He almost laughed. He dug into his jacket pocket and found one of the cards he'd had printed at the office supply store 2 years ago. The corner was bent. He gave it to her anyway. She looked at it. Holloway Auto. Ethan Holloway, proprietor. Route 9, Millhaven, Ohio. "Do you have a pen?" she asked. He found one in the same pocket. She turned the card over and handed it back to him. He looked at her for a second, then flipped it over and wrote 3 words on the blank side in his mechanic's half-legible scrawl. "Call if needed." He gave it back to her. "Why?" she asked. He shrugged. "In case you get another flat." He got in his truck and drove home. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the chicken and dumplings were cold. He ate them standing over the kitchen sink anyway, watching the rain streak down the window above it. Maya was asleep on the couch under a blanket, one arm hanging off the cushion, her small fingers curled around nothing. He turned off the TV she'd fallen asleep watching and carried her to bed. The next morning arrived the way November mornings do in Ohio. Gray and unhurried, the light coming in thin and flat like it couldn't be bothered to warm anything up. Ethan was at the shop by 7:15. The shop was a 3-bay garage on the south end of Route 9, a building he'd been renting for 6 years and trying to buy for 3. The sign above the door was the original one his father had put up in a different location 20 years back, remounted here after the old building sold. The letters had faded, but Ethan had never replaced it. Something about that felt important to him, though he couldn't explain it simply to anyone without sounding sentimental in a way he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He had a 2015 Chevy Silverado in Bay 1 with a transmission that was eating itself, and a Honda Accord in Bay 2 with a brake issue the owner had been ignoring long enough that it was now a real problem. He poured coffee from the machine he'd had for 12 years and started on the Honda because it was the faster job and he wanted the bay clear before noon. He had the front caliper off and was examining the rotor when he heard tires on gravel. He didn't look up right away. Customers pulled in all morning. But then he heard another set of tires, then another. And the gravel sound was different, heavier, evenly spaced, the sound of vehicles that have weight to them. He set down the rotor and walked to the bay door. 3 black SUVs were parked in his lot, not lined up the way customers park, but positioned, 2 flanking the entrance, 1 directly in front of the shop door. The kind of positioning that closes off your options before you've thought about what your options are. 4 men got out. Suits, all of them, which was unusual enough at 7:30 in the morning in Millhaven to be immediately strange. 2 of them were clearly security. The way they moved, the way they scanned the lot before anyone else stepped out. The third was a man in his 50s in a charcoal suit with silver cufflinks, carrying a leather portfolio. The fourth was younger, mid-30s, with the specific expression of someone who was there to deliver a message and had practiced being unpleasant about it. Ethan stood in the bay door with his coffee and waited. The man with the portfolio spoke first. "Mr. Holloway, I'm Gerald Price, representing the Ashford Group." He said it the way people say the name of a law firm or a government agency, expecting recognition, expecting a reaction. Ethan didn't give him one. "What can I do for you?" "We'd like to have a conversation about your interaction last night with Claire Ashford." The name meant nothing to him for exactly 2 seconds. Then it connected. Claire, dark coat, blown tire, Route 9. "She get home okay?" he asked. Something shifted in Price's expression. He'd expected a different first response. "She arrived home safely, yes. What concerns us is the nature of your interaction." "I changed her tire," Ethan said. "You approached a vulnerable woman alone on a highway at night. She was stranded," Ethan said. "Her hazards were on. Obtained her personal contact information. She asked for my card, I didn't ask for hers, and made unsolicited physical contact with her vehicle." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "She had a blown tire. I fixed it. That's it." The younger man, who hadn't introduced himself, stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, you need to understand who you're dealing with. Claire Ashford is the daughter of the late Richard Ashford. She controls significant interests in the Ashford Group. What you may have seen as a simple roadside encounter was a simple roadside encounter," Ethan said. "Could be interpreted as deliberate positioning, an attempt to insert yourself into her life under the guise of assistance." Ethan set his coffee mug down on the tool cart beside him. He did it slowly, not from drama, but because he wanted his hands free, and he didn't want to be holding something. "Let me make sure I understand," he said. "You drove here, all 4 of you, in 3 cars, to tell me that helping someone with a flat tire is suspicious?" "We're here to make certain you understand the situation clearly," Price said. "The situation is clear," Ethan said. "I helped someone. She gave me her first name. I gave her a card with 3 words on the back and drove home. I ate cold chicken soup for dinner and put my daughter to bed. That's my Tuesday night. We'd like you to agree not to contact Miss Ashford or respond to any contact from her." Ethan picked his coffee back up. "No." Price blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no. If she calls me because she needs help, I'm not going to hang up on her to make you comfortable." He looked at each of them in turn. "She's an adult. She can decide who she wants to talk to." The younger man's jaw tightened. "Mr. Holloway, you should consider your position carefully. A business like this—" He glanced around the shop with the kind of look that wasn't quite contempt but was right next to it, could find itself facing all kinds of complications. Ethan looked at him. Not a hard look, not a performance, just a direct one. The way you look at something you've correctly identified. "Is that a threat?" The man didn't answer. "Then we're done talking," Ethan said. He picked up the brake rotor he'd set down and walked back into the bay. "You're welcome to stand in my parking lot as long as you want. But I've got work to do." He went back to the Honda. He heard them conferring outside, low voices, the leather portfolio opening and closing. After about 4 minutes, he heard the SUV doors close and the engines start. He didn't watch them leave. He was already elbow deep in the brake assembly, and that problem, at least, was one he knew how to solve. What he didn't know was who Claire Ashford actually was. Not the name, not yet, but the weight of it. He found out around noon when his apprentice, a 22-year-old named Darius, who was better with his hands than his attention span and spent every lunch break on his phone, held up his screen across the shop. "Hey, did you say those guys this morning were from the Ashford Group?" "Yeah." "As in, like, Ashford Group Ashford?" Ethan looked up. "I don't know what that means, Darius." "Dude." Darius walked over and held the phone out. The screen showed a Forbes article from the previous year. The headline had the name Richard Ashford in it. Below it was a picture of a man in his late 60s, silver-haired, standing in front of what appeared to be a manufacturing facility. Below that, in the slideshow, was a more recent photo. A woman at some kind of formal event, in a dark dress, with sharp features and hair that caught the light. Ethan recognized the face. He took the phone and read for a minute. Richard Ashford, founder of the Ashford Group, which was, he scrolled, a holding company with interests in logistics, commercial real estate, and manufacturing, with operations across the Midwest and Eastern Seaboard. Net worth at time of his death, estimated at $3.2 billion. His daughter, Claire Ashford, had taken on a formal role in the company 18 months ago, following the completion of her MBA and a 3-year period at an investment consultancy in New York. Ethan handed the phone back. "You changed a billionaire's tire," Darius said, with the specific reverence of a 22-year-old encountering something that seems like it should have a different ending. "I changed someone's tire," Ethan said. "She had a flat. I helped." "And you didn't even," Darius started. "Go eat your lunch," Ethan said. Darius went. Ethan went back to the Silverado's transmission and spent the next hour and a half thinking about something other than Claire Ashford, which was easier than it sounds because a ruined transmission genuinely demands your full attention or you'll miss something and the job will come back to haunt you. But during the part of the afternoon when the work became automatic, the cleaning, the reassembly, the torque sequence he'd done hundreds of times, his mind wandered back to it. He thought about the men in the suits, about the particular arrogance of the younger one, the way he'd looked around the shop, about the implication, not even subtle, that a struggling mechanic in a faded jacket had to be after something, that the kindness had to be a strategy. He didn't feel angry about it exactly. He understood it in the way you understand how something works without agreeing that it should. If you had that much money and that much to protect, you probably did develop a specific kind of suspicion. You'd have to. People probably did approach Claire Ashford with strategies. The world probably was full of people who saw her as an opportunity rather than a person. He just wasn't one of them. He had 3 things he was actually worried about. Maya's dental appointment next week, which the insurance was going to cover only partially. The rent on the shop, which was 4 years into a 5-year lease he'd signed when things were going slightly better, and the landlord had already made noises about raising it. And the transmission job in Bay 1, which the owner was going to want done by Friday and was shaping up to be more complicated than the estimate. He didn't have space in his actual life to run a scheme. The call came 4 days later. He was closing up the shop, rolling the bay doors down, when his phone rang. Unknown number, Columbus area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. He almost always let unknowns go to voicemail. But something made him pick it up. Holloway Auto. A pause. Then, "Is this Ethan?" He recognized the voice, controlled even, the kind of voice that had learned to be careful. "Yeah," he said. "Claire?" "Yes." Another pause. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I got your number from the card. I should have said that." "It's fine. Everything okay?" "Yes, a brief hesitation that felt genuine. I wanted to apologize for what happened with my mother's people, Gerald Price and whoever else showed up." "Your mother's people?" "The Ashford Group security team. They work for my mother primarily. Margaret Ashford." She said the name with a particular flatness. "She found out someone had approached me on the highway. She reacted. They told me not to respond if you contacted me." "I know." A beat. "Are you responding?" "Apparently." Something loosened slightly on the other end of the line. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. "I wanted you to know I didn't send them. And I didn't ask them to threaten you. That was not... I wouldn't do that." "I didn't think you did," he said, and he meant it. "Okay." She paused. "Also, I wanted to tell you that I looked at your shop, online, the reviews." Another pause. "People trust you." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "I try to do good work." "My father had a car," she said then, and the shift in her voice was slight but noticeable, like someone stepping onto a floor they're not sure about. "It's a 1967 Jaguar E-Type. He was restoring it himself before he got sick. He never finished it." She stopped. "I'm not sure why I'm telling you this." "It's okay," he said. "I looked at 3 restoration shops. 2 in Columbus, 1 in Cleveland. They all gave me quotes, and they all talked about the car like it was an asset, like something to be appraised. Another pause. You wrote 3 words on a card and drove away. That's a different kind of person. Ethan leaned against the bay door, looking out at the parking lot. The evening was cold and still. A plastic bag skidded slowly across the gravel and stopped against the fence. I'm a mechanic, Claire. I work on engines. That's what I do. I know. That's why I'm calling. She let the silence settle for just a moment. I'd like you to look at the car. Just look at it. No commitment, no contract. If it's not something you want to take on, you say so, and that's it. He thought about the lease, the dental appointment, the transmission that had taken longer than expected and eaten into the week's margin. Where is it? He asked. Our family estate, outside Granville. She added, I'll pay for your time, travel, consultation, whatever the going rate is. I don't need you to… Ethan. She said his name the same way he'd said hers on the highway, gently but clearly. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm asking you to do one for me, a mommy. Let me pay you for your time. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Saturday morning? I can do Saturday. I'll send the address. A pause. Thank you, and I'm glad I didn't cancel roadside assistance sooner, or you wouldn't have pulled over. Yeah, he said. I almost didn't. She said goodnight and hung up. Ethan stood in the cold parking lot for another moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he pulled the bay door the rest of the way down, locked it, and went to pick up Maya from Mrs. Pacheco's. Maya Holloway was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, which was both a gift and a thing that caught Ethan off guard sometimes at random moments. She was currently obsessed with volcanoes, not in a passing interest kind of way, but in the relentless total commitment way that children pursue things when they've found their current everything. She had library books about volcanoes. She'd drawn volcanoes on the back of Ethan's supply invoices. She'd asked him last week whether you could live inside a dormant volcano if you built the structure correctly. He'd said he didn't know, and they'd looked it up together, which was how most of their evenings went. Him half knowing something, her unsatisfied with half, both of them ending up on the laptop in the kitchen. Maya's mother, Renee, had left when Maya was 3. It wasn't a simple story, and Ethan didn't tell it simply. Renee had problems, real ones, the kind that don't get fixed by willpower or good intentions. And she'd left because staying was making them worse, or that's how she'd explained it. He didn't hate her for it. He'd stopped being angry about it sometime around Maya's 5th birthday, when he'd realized that the anger was costing him energy he needed for the actual job in front of him, which was raising a person. Maya didn't ask about her much anymore. When she did, Ethan answered honestly and without editorializing. That was the best he could do, and he knew it. Dad? Maya said in the back seat on the drive home. Mrs. Pacheco's TV is really loud. It is, he agreed. She watches the news all the time. She does? There was a thing about a family with a lot of money. Is that boring? She asked. Having a lot of money? He thought about it. I don't know. I've never had a lot of money. Do you want a lot of money? I want enough, he said. Enough to fix the roof on the shop and get you to the dentist, and maybe someday take a trip somewhere warm. Where warm? I haven't gotten that far. I want to see Hawaii, she said, because there are active volcanoes. Naturally, he said. She was quiet for a block. Dad? Yeah. Are we okay? He glanced in the rearview mirror at her. She was looking out the window, not at him, which sometimes meant she was asking casually and sometimes meant she'd been building up to it. We're okay, he said. Things are tight right now, but tight isn't broken. She nodded slowly. Okay. Why do you ask? You looked tired at dinner last week, she said. The kind of tired that's not just sleep. He almost said I'm fine. That automatic, reflexive response. But Maya had a way of sitting with honesty better than most adults he knew, and she deserved better than autopilot. I am tired, he said, but I'm handling it. That's different from not handling it. She seemed to think that was reasonable. Okay? They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over 7 years of being each other's main company. He made grilled cheese for dinner because it was late and it was what they had. Maya read him 3 pages of a volcano book while he cleaned up, and then he got her to bed and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and went through the shop finances for the 40-something time that month, looking for the number to move to make everything work. He didn't find a new one. He never did. He just found the same arrangement of numbers and moved them around until they almost made sense. He wrote Saturday, Granville on the corner of the legal pad, and went to bed. Saturday came in cold and clear. The sky, that particular shade of pale winter blue that promises nothing in the way of warmth. Ethan drove the 90 minutes to Granville in his truck. The Holloway Auto logo faded on the door, his tool bag on the passenger seat more out of habit than necessity. He wasn't going to fix anything today. He was going to look. He'd looked up the Ashford estate. He hadn't been able to stop himself. And even the property records, which were what you could find without paying for anything, suggested something significant. 46 acres, primary residence assessed at. He'd stopped reading. He didn't want to walk in with a number in his head. The gate was iron, the old-fashioned kind that swings on a track rather than folds back. A security camera sat at the top of the pillar, and when he pulled up, a guard came out of a small booth and asked for his name and checked a list on a tablet. "Mr. Holloway, Miss Ashford is expecting you. Follow the main drive." The main drive was a quarter-mile of gravel between old maples that had dropped their leaves weeks ago, skeletal now, against the pale sky. The kind of trees that make you think about how long things can last if you let them. The house was large without being ostentatious, or it would have been, except that it was just genuinely, factually large, in a way that the word house barely covered. 3 stories of stone and dark wood, wings extending off the central mass, an attached garage on the east side that was bigger than Ethan's shop. Claire was standing on the front steps. She was in jeans and a pullover, hair pulled back, and she looked different than she had in the rain, less guarded somehow, or maybe just less waterlogged. She came down the steps as he pulled up and actually shook his hand when he got out of the truck. "You found it okay?" "GPS works out here," he said. "Come on, the car's in the main garage." She led him around the side of the house. As they walked, a curtain moved in a second-floor window. He noticed it, filed it, said nothing. The garage was separated from the main house by a covered walkway and held 4 vehicles, 3 of which Ethan identified automatically. A Range Rover, a current model Mercedes S-Class, and what looked like a restoration-ready 1970s BMW tucked in the corner. But the 4th was what stopped him. The Jaguar was under a canvas cover in the far bay. Claire pulled the cover back without ceremony and let him look. It was a 1967 E-Type Roadster, long nose, Series 1, British racing green, or it had been once. The paint was dull now, chalky in places, with spots of surface rust along the lower sills. The chrome was pitted. The leather was cracked and had a split running down the driver's seat. The hood, Jaguar called it a bonnet, the word surfaced somewhere in Ethan's memory from a restoration form he'd read years ago, was propped open, and the engine below it was clearly mid-disassembly. A 6-cylinder inline, the 4.2-liter unit, with vacuum lines disconnected and lying like loose thread, a carburetor sitting separately on a workbench nearby, valve covers off and leaning against the firewall. Ethan walked around it slowly. He crouched and looked at the underside with his phone light. He stood up and looked at the engine without touching anything yet. "What'd he get done?" he asked. "I'm not sure exactly," Claire said. She was standing near the hood, arms crossed, watching him in the specific way people watch someone look at something they love and are afraid to hope about. He stripped the interior himself over about 2 years, sent the carburetor out to be rebuilt, but then he got the diagnosis, and things changed. That was about 3 years ago. So he got it to here and stopped. Yes. Ethan put his hand on the top of the fender. The metal was cold. He could feel the texture of the paint under his palm, the slight roughness where the clear had oxidized. "She's not as far gone as she looks," he said. Claire looked at him. "You think it's fixable?" "I think it was fixable when he stopped, and it's still fixable. The question is what kind of restoration you want." He straightened up. You want to know what I need to assess it properly? Yes. A few hours, just me, the car, and a flashlight. No clock on it. She nodded. Take whatever time you need. He spent the next 2.5 hours with the Jaguar, working slowly and methodically, the way his father had taught him to approach an unfamiliar engine. Not looking for what was wrong immediately, but learning what it was first. Understanding the layout, the sequence, the logic of how Richard Ashford had been working through the restoration. There was a notepad on the workbench, water-stained, and several of the entries were in a neat, precise handwriting that had to be Richard Ashford's. Parts ordered, measurements taken, notes about torque specs, and a mention of a machinist named Callie in Columbus who'd done the valve guides. Ethan read the notepad carefully. He felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Claire came back at one point with 2 mugs of coffee and set them on the workbench without interrupting. He looked up and said thanks. She said nothing and left again. When he finally stepped back and looked at the whole car again, he had a solid picture. Okay, he said when she came back. She'd brought sandwiches too, which he appreciated more than he said. They sat on a couple of shop stools her father had apparently kept in the garage, the kind with the swivel seat and the ring footrest, scuffed and paint spattered. Tell me, she said. The engine's closer to done than it looks. The carburetor work your father sent out. That's the hard part, actually. You've got a to-do list, but it's a list, not a mystery. He went through it methodically. Fuel lines, electrical. The interior, which would need a full retrim, and he knew someone for that. Brakes. Suspension bushings, definitely. The body was sound, surface rust, not structural. How long? She asked. Realistically, 5 to 6 months if I'm doing it around my shop's regular work. I can't take it back to Millhaven. A car like this, you don't move it more than you have to until the mechanicals are done. So I'd have to come here. I know. She picked up her coffee. I thought about that. You could use this bay full time. I'll have a key made. He looked around the garage. It was climate controlled, well lit, with better tool storage than his own shop. What are you thinking in terms of the arrangement? Fair rate for your time. Whatever you'd charge a customer for the hours, plus materials at cost. I don't want to lowball you, and I don't want to overpay you either. My father always said the worst thing you could do to a skilled person was treat their work like charity. She paused. I think he'd have liked you. Ethan looked at the car. At the open engine and the notepad and the rebuilt carburetor sitting on the bench waiting to go back in. When do you want to start? He asked. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Monday? Monday, he said. That was how it began. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a moment that announced itself. Just a man sitting down on a shop stool, agreeing to finish what another man had started, and the engine of a 1967 Jaguar waiting cold and patient in the garage while the light changed outside the windows. Ethan drove home that afternoon with a legal pad full of notes and a number in his head that, if the work went as planned, would solve most of what was keeping him up at night. Not all of it, but most. Maya was at the kitchen table when he got home, drawing something that was clearly a volcano. How was it? She asked without looking up. Interesting, he said. Is the car cool? Yeah, it's really cool. She looked up at that. She could always tell when he meant it. Can I see it sometime? Maybe, he said. We'll see. He hung up his jacket, started water boiling for pasta, and spent the evening being exactly the person he'd always been. Not a schemer, not a strategist, not someone inserting himself into anything. Just a mechanic who showed up and did the work. In 3 weeks, everything around that simple fact was going to become enormously complicated. But tonight, he didn't know that yet. Tonight, the water came to a boil, and Maya explained to him, in considerable detail, why the Kilauea volcano was currently the most interesting thing happening on Earth. He listened. He always listened. That was the thing about Ethan Holloway that nobody in a suit had bothered to figure out yet. He wasn't building anything. He was just paying attention. And sometimes, in the right circumstances, that turns out to be enough to change everything. He started on Monday, the way he said he would. Ethan loaded his personal toolbox into the truck Sunday night. Not the shop tools, but the ones he'd accumulated over 15 years that he didn't lend to anyone, and didn't leave overnight in a bay he wasn't locking himself. The 3/8 drive ratchet his father had given him. The set of combination wrenches he'd bought used and sharpened on both ends, a digital multimeter that was 6 years old but still accurate to 3 decimal places. He wrapped everything in shop rags and packed it tight so nothing rattled, the way you pack something you care about. The drive to Granville was 90 minutes on a clear morning. He was on the road by 6:15 because he'd told himself 6:30 and knew himself well enough to account for the gap. Maya was with Mrs. Pacheco for the day, a Monday off school for some teacher development thing, and had made him promise to describe the Jaguar in detail when he got home. Like, all the details, she'd said. Not just the engine, the color too. He got to the estate at 7:40. The guard at the gate was different from Saturday, a younger man who checked his name against the same tablet and waved him through with the specific boredom of someone who does this 40 times a day. The drive looked different in the early light, the maples throwing long shadows across the gravel, frost still on the grass on either side. The garage was unlocked. Someone had left the lights on inside, and there was a key on the workbench with a small tag that read, Garage, EH in handwriting that wasn't Claire's. Someone else's careful printing. Next to the key was a thermos of coffee, still warm. Ethan stood there for a second looking at the thermos. Then he poured a cup, set up his tools, and got to work. The first week was purely diagnostic. He wasn't fixing anything yet, just understanding the full picture. What Richard Ashford had completed, what he'd started and left mid-task, and what he simply hadn't gotten to. The notepad from the workbench became a reference document, and Ethan added his own pages to it, his handwriting messier than Richard's, but organized in its own way, columns of part numbers and condition notes and questions he'd need to answer before proceeding. The engine was the most interesting part. Richard Ashford had known what he was doing. That was clear from the first hour. He hadn't been a hobbyist playing at restoration. He'd understood the mechanical logic of the 4.2-liter inline. 6. The way someone understands it only after reading deeply and then getting their hands dirty enough to test what they've read. The work he'd done was careful, unhurried, done by someone who wasn't racing toward a deadline. It was the work of a man who'd expected to have more time. Ethan noted that and moved on, because sentimentality didn't help anyone finish an engine. Claire appeared around 10 on the first morning, coming through the door from the covered walkway with her own cup of coffee and a folder under her arm. She was dressed like she had a meeting somewhere. Not a suit exactly, but professional, composed. She stopped at the edge of the bay and watched him work for a moment before speaking. "How's it looking?" "Better than Saturday," he said from under the hood. "Your father was organized. His notes are good. Makes my job easier." She came a little closer. "He was an engineer originally, before the company became what it became. He used to say the only honest work he'd ever done was with his hands." Ethan straightened up. What did he mean by that? He meant that when you're building something physical, it either works or it doesn't. There's no, she paused, no narrative you can put on it, no spin. She looked at the engine. Once the company got big enough, everything became about the story around the numbers rather than the numbers themselves. He hated that. Did he say that to the people running the company? He said it to my mother, Claire said. Who is one of the people running the company? Ethan looked at her. They had a complicated relationship, she said, with the particular flatness of a sentence that contains an entire history. He didn't push. He went back to the carburetor inspection. But she stayed. Not interrupting, not hovering, just present. She sat on one of the stools and answered emails on her phone while he worked, and after a while the silence between them became the functional kind, the kind two people can share in a small space without it being strange. Ethan found himself talking occasionally, not explaining what he was doing but narrating it loosely, the way he did when Maya watched him work in the home garage, partly to keep his own thinking organized, partly just out of habit. The fuel lines are going to need replacement. They're original rubber, and original rubber on a car this age means they're brittle even if they look okay. You don't find out they're not okay at a good time. He held one up and flexed it slightly. See how it doesn't want to move? That's the problem. Is that expensive? Parts aren't. Time's the cost. He set it back. Everything on this car is time. I know, she said. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. My father used to come out here on Sunday mornings. Just him in the car. My mother thought it was a waste. She kept suggesting he hire someone to do it faster. Why didn't he? Because faster wasn't the point. She looked at the car, and something in her expression was different from the professional composure she'd walked in with. Something older and quieter. He said the car wasn't a destination. It was the only place he could think slowly. Ethan nodded. He understood that in his body before he understood it in words. Some engines were just that, a problem complex enough to require your whole mind, which meant your whole mind went quiet about everything else. He'd been going to his shop at 11 at night for years just to have somewhere to put himself when the apartment felt too small and the money problems felt too loud. "You miss him," he said. It wasn't a question. "Every day," she said simply. Then, "He would have liked you. You said that on Saturday." "I meant it on Saturday, too." They left it there. The days developed a rhythm over the first 2 weeks. Ethan arrived early, worked through the morning, broke for lunch, usually something he'd packed, occasionally something Claire brought, and continued into the afternoon. He drove home by 5 to pick up Maya or have her dropped off, depending on the day. He kept his regular shop hours in the evenings when he could, delegating more to Darius than he was entirely comfortable with, which meant calling to check in at odd moments, and occasionally driving back to Millhaven at 7 p.m. to look at something Darius was uncertain about. It wasn't a sustainable pace, but it was a temporary one, and Ethan could do temporary. What he hadn't calculated was Margaret Ashford. He met her on the 9th day, which was a Thursday. He'd been at the garage since 7, deep into the electrical system, which on a 1967 British sports car was, as someone on a forum he'd read had memorably put it, a controlled electrical fire that had agreed, provisionally, to be a wiring harness. The original Lucas Electrics were famous for unreliability, and this car's were no exception. He was tracing a short circuit through a bundle of cloth-wrapped wiring when he heard the door from the house open. The footsteps were different from Claire's. He pulled his head out from under the dash and turned around. The woman standing at the edge of the garage was in her early 60s, elegant in the specific way that requires maintenance, the kind of poise that was probably natural once but had been practiced for so long it was now indistinguishable from nature. She was wearing slacks and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly truck payment. Her hair was silver and carefully arranged. She was looking at him with the kind of expression that didn't reveal its conclusion. "You're the mechanic," she said. "Ethan Holloway," he said. He didn't extend his hand because his hands were covered in 50-year-old electrical insulation residue. "Mrs. Ashford. Margaret." She said it the way people who prefer their first name say it, not as a warmth, but as a correction. She looked past him at the open car, at the notepad on the bench, at the organized row of tools. "I didn't know you'd started already. We agreed to Monday. That was 9 days ago. Claire doesn't always inform me of these things." She walked slowly toward the car, not toward him, as though he were furniture she was stepping around. She looked at the engine for a long moment. "My husband started this in 2019. I know. His notes are good. They've helped." She looked at him then, directly, and he got the full weight of it. He spent 4 years on this car, and it went nowhere. He was working slowly. That's not the same as going nowhere. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not softening exactly, more like a recalibration. "You have a daughter. Maya. She's 7. I know your name and your situation, Mr. Holloway. Gerald Price is thorough." "I assumed," Ethan said, "you should know that I wasn't trying to intimidate you when I sent him." She said it matter-of-factly, as though intimidation were a thing one simply decided not to do rather than something assessed in hindsight. "I was protecting my daughter. From someone who changed her tire. From a stranger who approached her alone at night and inserted himself into her life." She kept her voice even. "You may find that excessive. I don't have the luxury of finding it excessive." Ethan leaned against the car's fender, carefully, on the trailing edge where it wouldn't stress anything, and looked at her. "How old is Claire?" A pause. 30? "And she's run major investment decisions. That's in the public record." He wasn't being aggressive. He was genuinely following the logic, but she can't decide for herself whether a mechanic who changed her tire is safe to talk to. Margaret's jaw tightened fractionally. You don't understand what it's like to have a target on your back from the day you're born. You're right, he said. I don't, but I understand what it's like to have someone decide what you are before you've done anything. He paused. It's not a good feeling for the person it's being done to. The silence in the garage was complete for about 5 seconds. Ethan could hear a bird outside and the faint tick of the engine cooling from his earlier work. Margaret looked back at the Jaguar. He bought this car 3 months after Richard's first diagnosis, she said, and her voice was exactly the same, which somehow made it worse. He said it gave him something to do with the time. She paused. I thought it was avoidance. Now I think I may have been wrong about that. Ethan said nothing. There were moments when saying nothing was the most honest response available. Finish the car, she said finally. Not warmly, not coldly, just directly. Whatever Claire's arrangement with you is, finish the car. She left the way she'd come, through the door to the house. Ethan stood in the garage for a moment, then went back to the wiring. He didn't mention the encounter to Claire until that evening, when she came by at the end of the day. He told her simply and without editorializing. Her mother had come in, they'd spoken briefly, and it had been fine. Claire listened to this with an expression that was mostly neutral, but had something underneath it. What did she say? She told me to finish the car. That's more than I expected. She looked at the hood, still propped. She hasn't been in here since the funeral. I didn't know she came in today. She was here for maybe 10 minutes. What did you talk about? He thought about it. She told me why she sent Price. I told her it didn't feel good to be prejudged. She told me your father bought the car after the diagnosis. He paused. We didn't agree about everything, but we talked straight, which I think was probably what needed to happen. Claire was quiet for a moment. She doesn't talk straight to me. I know. How do you know? Because you tense up when she comes up in conversation, he said. You've done it 3 or 4 times since I started here. She looked at him. Not defensively, but caught, slightly. Like he'd named something she'd been hoping was less visible. She's not a bad person, she said, but it came out like something she'd told herself more than something she was telling him. I don't think she is, Ethan said. I think she's afraid, and she's been afraid so long she's stopped noticing that's what it is. When did you get a psychology degree? Claire asked, and it was almost dry, almost humor. I have a 7-year-old, he said. You learn to recognize fear wearing other faces. She almost laughed. Not quite, but close. She's going to come back, you know. Now that she knows you're here, she's going to want to assess you more thoroughly. Let her, he said simply. I don't have anything to hide. Claire looked at him for a long moment. There was something working in her expression, not attraction exactly, or not only that, but something more like the specific cautious wonder of someone who has learned to expect a strategy and keeps finding none. Most people who say that do, she said. I know, he said. I'm not most people. He picked up his jacket and his toolbox. I'll see you Thursday. I need to order a wiring harness. Should have it by Wednesday. Okay, she said. He drove home. Margaret did come back, as Claire predicted. Not the next day, but the one after, and she came with a cup of tea and stood near the workbench without quite speaking for the first 10 minutes while Ethan worked on the brake master cylinder. It wasn't comfortable silence. It was the silence of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether to. Eventually, she said, Do you know what this car was worth when Richard bought it? These days, a driver-quality 1967 E-Type Series 1 Roadster goes somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000, Ethan said, depending on originality and the market. When he bought it, probably less. The market's gone up. He paid $62,000 for it, she said. And we were not comfortable at that point. The company was in its 4th year. We were still taking salary draws rather than profit. A pause. I told him we couldn't afford it. What did he say? She was quiet for a moment. He said some things were worth more than what you could afford. She turned her teacup in her hands. I thought he was being irresponsible. I still don't entirely disagree, but... She stopped. But Ethan looked up. He was right that it mattered in ways I didn't understand, she said, with the specific reluctance of someone not used to completing sentences like that one. Ethan set down the cylinder and straightened up, wiping his hands. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Ashford? Margaret? Margaret. He kept his voice neutral. When you think about this car, what do you actually feel? She looked at him with the same direct weight as the first time. I beg your pardon? Not what you think about it, what you feel. The silence this time was longer, a bird outside, the tick of the engine. I feel guilty, she said finally, and the evenness of her voice cost her something. He could see it cost her. He wanted me to come out here with him. I rarely did. I thought there would be more time. There usually isn't, Ethan said. That's one of the things about time. She looked at him as if deciding something. You say very direct things. I'm a mechanic. Everything is either aligned or it isn't. I'm not good at pretending things are aligned when they're not. She turned and looked at the Jaguar, the full length of it, from the long hood to the rounded tail. Claire has changed since you started coming here, she said. She's less careful. That's not meant as a criticism. She's been too careful for too long. She's figuring herself out, Ethan said. Seems like she's been on hold for a while. Margaret was quiet again. Then, her father would have said the same thing. She came every other day after that, for intervals that ranged from 10 minutes to nearly an hour. She never touched the car and never pretended to be interested in the mechanical specifics, but she stood near it, and sometimes she talked about Richard, and sometimes she talked about the company, and occasionally she said things about Claire that were clearly about Claire but framed at an angle, not quite direct, as though she was practicing getting there. Ethan listened. He didn't offer opinions unless she asked for them, and when she did ask, he gave them straight. He wasn't trying to heal anything. He wasn't running a mediation. He was there to fix an engine, and these conversations happened around the edges of that work, organically, the way conversations happen when people spend time in the same space without a formal agenda. That was all. But slowly, with the specific patience of someone who understood that things that have been stuck for a long time don't move fast, something started to shift in the Ashford garage. Margaret stopped arriving with her defenses fully deployed. She started asking questions that were actually questions rather than tests. Once, she asked him whether he thought Claire was lonely, and when he said he thought so, carefully, honestly, she sat with that for a long time without saying anything. Ethan ordered the wiring harness, and it arrived 2 days late, which set him back on the electrical work but gave him time to address the fuel system. He pulled the tank and found it cleaner than expected. Richard had apparently had it sealed and treated at some point, which wasn't in the notes but was legible in the condition. He wrote it in his own notes. He felt obscurely like he was having a conversation with a man he'd never met, reading the evidence of decisions made years ago, trying to understand the logic, and then extending it. The brake system was the worst job on the car. The rear calipers were seized, not seized as in difficult, but seized as in a metallurgical argument between the piston and the bore that had been going on for 3 years and was not interested in mediation. He spent a full day on the rear brakes alone, using heat and penetrant and time, the 3 things you needed when metal didn't want to cooperate. He broke 2 bleed nipples and had to drill them out, which added half a day. And he ordered new calipers because the originals weren't worth rebuilding at this point, and told Claire that on the phone that evening. How much? She asked. About $800 for a quality pair, plus my time drilling out the old ones. Fine, order them. Just checking. Ethan, she said it the same way she had on the phone that first night, clear, unhurried. I trust your judgment on the car. That's why I hired you. Okay, he said. How's Maya? The question caught him slightly off guard, not because it was strange, but because it was genuine. She asked it the way people ask about someone they actually think about, not as a conversational formality. She's good. She started a project at school where she's tracking volcanic activity globally. Is that a normal first-grade project? It's a Maya project, he said, which is different. He could hear the smile in the silence. I'd like to meet her sometime, Claire said, if that's ever something that made sense. We'll see, he said, in the same tone he'd used with Maya when Maya asked about seeing the car. which he recognized as a deflection and suspected Claire also recognized as a deflection, but it was an honest one. He wasn't ready to mix these things together yet. His life had compartments not out of secrecy, but out of a specific need to keep some things from becoming complicated before he understood them. What he didn't know was that someone else was already making that decision for him. There was a man named Derek Holt who had been the Ashford Group's head of strategic development for 7 years. He was 44, well-dressed in the manner of someone who'd decided clothing was a professional tool, and he had the particular intelligence of someone who was very good at reading power dynamics and slightly less good at everything else. He'd been a fixture at Margaret's side during the period after Richard's death, a presence at every significant meeting, and he had specific ideas about the direction of the Ashford Group that depended on Margaret's fear and isolation remaining exactly as they were. Ethan didn't know Derek Holt existed yet, but Derek Holt had known about Ethan Holloway since the morning Gerald Price filed his initial report. The report was 3 pages. It covered Ethan's background: no criminal record, single father, struggling small business, no known connections to the financial or legal worlds, no prior relationship with any member of the Ashford family. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be. Gerald Price's conclusion had been that there was no threat. Derek Holt read the same report and reached a different conclusion. Not about Ethan's intentions, but about his effect. A person without an agenda, who somehow ended up in Margaret Ashford's orbit and made her fractionally less guarded, that was more dangerous than any schemer. You could understand a schemer. You could defend against a schemer. You couldn't defend against someone who just walked in, changed a tire, and told the truth. Holt had been watching the dynamic in the garage from a distance, through the reports Margaret's security team filed, which she didn't know he had access to, because he'd cultivated the right person on the security staff 2 years ago for exactly this kind of contingency. He watched Claire become more present at the estate, more involved in family matters, less deferential in board conversations. He watched Margaret begin to soften, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but in the incremental way that eventually adds up to something significant. He needed to stop it before it became significant. His first move was subtle. A lunch with Gerald Price where he raised, in a collegial and measured way, whether the level of access being given to this mechanic was really advisable given the sensitive nature of the family's assets. Price was nothing if not cautious, and he agreed to tighten the documentation requirements. Signing in, vehicle searches, a background check renewal. All of it felt bureaucratic rather than hostile. Ethan noticed it on a Thursday morning when the guard at the gate asked him to open his toolbox for inspection. He did it. He didn't ask why. He opened every tray and every case and let the guard check whatever he needed to check, and then he drove to the garage and went to work. He mentioned it to Claire that afternoon. "They searched your tools?" "Gate guard. Took about 4 minutes." She set down her coffee and her expression was doing something controlled and precise. "That wasn't my instruction." "I figured." "It was—" She stopped. "I'll deal with it." "You don't need to make a fight over it," Ethan said. "I don't care about the search. I have nothing in the toolbox that isn't tools." "That's not the point." "I know." He looked at her. "But pick your battles. If you burn capital on a toolbox search, you've got less for the things that matter more." She stared at him. "When did you start thinking about capital?" "I've always thought about capital," he said. "I just call it differently. If I argue with a customer about every small thing, I've got nothing left when there's a real disagreement. Same principle." She thought about that. Then she nodded, slow and reluctant, and he could see her pulling back from the impulse to make a call and escalate it. "Fine," she said, "but I'm paying attention to it." "Good," he said. What neither of them knew yet was that the toolbox search was only a test. Derek Holt was measuring something. How Ethan reacted, whether he complained, whether Claire's reaction when she heard about it would reveal the degree of trust that had developed between them. The results told him what he needed to know. He began making other arrangements. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't leave a clear line back to him. Meanwhile, in the Ashford garage, Ethan finished the new wiring harness installation. He tested every circuit with the multimeter one by one, checking continuity and voltage drop and ground resistance, annotating the results in his notepad. The car's electrical system, which had been a controlled catastrophe when he'd started, was becoming coherent. A logical network of connections, each one understood, each one verified. It was slow work and repetitive work, and it was the kind of work Ethan was actually good at. Not because it was glamorous, but because he didn't get bored of it. He was tracing the circuit for the instrument cluster on a Wednesday afternoon when Margaret came in and sat on the stool and didn't say anything for nearly 15 minutes. He left her to it. When she finally spoke, she said, "I think I was unfair to Richard about the car." Ethan looked up from the wiring diagram. "Not just the car," she said. "The way he needed to. Slow down sometimes. I kept pushing. The company, the growth, the next thing. I thought standing still was falling behind." She looked at her hands in her lap. "He used to say I was the engine and he was the suspension. I didn't take it as a compliment." "He probably meant it as one," Ethan said. "I know that now." Her voice was even, but barely. "You can know things too late, and the knowing doesn't undo it." Ethan set down the wiring diagram. He stayed sitting on the ground, back against the car, because standing up would make it a different kind of conversation, and this one didn't need to be a different kind. "For what it's worth," he said, "the car got here. He got it to a point where someone could finish it. That's not nothing." "He didn't finish it." "No," Ethan said. "But he started it in a way that made finishing possible. That's actually most of the work." She looked at the Jaguar. The engine was beginning to look like an engine again. The wiring tidier, the new fuel lines in place, the rebuilt carburetor waiting on the bench to be reinstalled. There was still a long way to go, but the car no longer looked abandoned. It looked paused. "Claire should have had more of his patience," Margaret said. "She got my drive and her father's standards, which is a difficult combination." "She's managing," Ethan said. "She's struggling," Margaret said. "She has been since he died. She holds it too tightly. She doesn't know how to—" She stopped. "She doesn't know how to need people." Ethan thought about Claire on the highway in the rain, holding her phone up for light, crouching next to a blown tire in a long coat, refusing to look panicked. "She asks for help when she needs it," he said. "She called me." "You were a stranger." "Sometimes that's easier." Margaret looked at him, and this time there was something different in the directness of it. Not the assessment of the first day, which had been essentially a property inspection. This was something more complicated and more honest. "She trusts you," she said, "more than she's trusted anyone in a while." "Do you understand what that means, given what her life looks like?" "I think I'm starting to," he said. "Don't break it," she said. She said it the same way she said everything, evenly, without drama. But the weight behind it was unmistakable. It wasn't a threat. It was a request. The difference mattered. "I won't," Ethan said. She stood up, straightened her sweater, and picked up her teacup. At the door, she paused. "The carburetor rebuild. Who did it?" "It was done before you arrived." "According to your husband's notes, someone named Callie in Columbus." "Callie Marsh," she said. "She rebuilt one for Richard's BMW in 2017. He said she was the best." A pause. "He was usually right about who was the best." She left. Ethan sat on the floor of the garage for a moment longer, back against the car, looking at the ceiling. Then he picked up the wiring diagram and found his place and kept going. Outside, in an office in Columbus, Derek Holt was on the phone. The conversation was short and quiet. He was not a man who needed many words to set something in motion. The car was getting closer to finished. And something else, something Ethan couldn't see from where he was sitting, was getting closer to starting. The story that Derek Holt told wasn't complicated. The best ones never are. It started as a rumor, the kind that doesn't announce itself as a rumor but arrives dressed as concern. A source inside the Ashford Group's legal department mentioned to a contact at a regional business publication that there were questions being raised internally about the security protocols at the family estate. Nothing specific, just questions. The kind of thing a journalist files away and waits on. 2 weeks later, the same source mentioned a name. Ethan Holloway, a mechanic from Millhaven with routine access to the property. Someone who had been given, according to this source, unsupervised time in spaces that contained, and here the language became careful and deliberate, sensitive family documents, and private correspondence related to ongoing estate matters. The journalist, a 38-year-old named Paul Rennick, who wrote for a Columbus business outlet and had been trying to get a foothold into Ashford Group coverage for 2 years, made 3 calls to verify before running anything. 2 of them went to Ashford Group Communications, which declined comment. The third went to Gerald Price's office, which also declined comment, but in a way that Rennick read correctly as not a full denial. He published on a Thursday morning. The headline was measured, but the implication was not. Security questions emerge around Ashford Estate as outside contractor given extended access. The article named Ethan. It mentioned his shop, his address, the fact that he was a single father. It described him as having been found by the side of the road by Claire Ashford and subsequently hired without the full knowledge of the family's security team. It quoted an unnamed source saying there were concerns about whether confidential documents related to estate planning had been accessed or photographed during the contractor's visits. Ethan was under the Jaguar's chassis, working on a rear suspension bushing, when his phone rang for the 3rd time in 40 minutes. The first 2 had been from numbers he didn't recognize. The 3rd was from Darius. "Hey," Darius said, and his voice had the particular quality of someone trying to sound casual about something that wasn't casual. "Have you seen there's this article." "What article?" "From the Columbus Business Journal. I'm going to text you the link." Ethan slid out from under the car, sat up, and waited for his phone to buzz. He clicked the link and read it standing in the middle of the garage with grease on his forearms and the smell of old rubber still on his hands. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the workbench and stood there for a moment looking at the Jaguar. His jaw was tight. His hands were not entirely steady, which was unusual for him. He picked the phone back up and called Claire. She answered on the 2nd ring. "I saw it," she said. She didn't say hello. "Ethan, I want you to know, have they called you for a statement?" "My communications director fielded it. We declined comment." "Which reads as confirmation," he said. A beat. I know that. I'm dealing with it." "Claire," he kept his voice level with some effort, "there are no documents in that garage. Your father's notepad, my notes, a wiring diagram I printed from a form. That's what's in there. I know that. The garage doesn't connect to any part of the house. I don't have a key to the house. I've never been in the house except the front room once when you gave me coffee." "Ethan, I need you to understand what I'm telling you," he said. "Not because I think you don't believe me, because when people start asking questions, what matters is what I actually have access to, and I need to be clear about that." "I believe you," she said quietly. "I know exactly what access you have, and I know what's in that garage. I set that up. I know." A pause. "This isn't coming from inside the family directly. I think I know where it's coming from, and I'm trying to verify that before I say anything." "Who?" She didn't answer immediately. "Let me call you back in an hour." "Okay. Don't talk to any journalists." "I wasn't planning on it," he said. He hung up and went back to the suspension bushing because he didn't know what else to do, and the car was still there, and still needed work, and the bushing wasn't going to wait for this to resolve itself. He'd been back under the chassis for about 20 minutes when his phone rang again. This time, it was a number he recognized, the Licking County Sheriff's Office. He'd had cause to call them once, 2 years back, about a car that came in with a title that didn't match the VIN. He knew the prefix. He slid out and answered. "Mr. Holloway, this is Detective Marlins, Licking County. I'm calling in connection with an active investigation involving the Ashford family estate. We'd like to ask you some questions. Can you come in this afternoon?" He sat on the concrete floor of the garage with his back against the Jaguar's rear quarter panel and looked at the ceiling and breathed. "Am I required to?" he asked. "At this point, we're asking voluntarily," Marlin said, "but I'd encourage you to cooperate. It tends to be better for everyone. What is this investigation about?" "We can discuss that when you come in." He called a lawyer. Not because he had one. He didn't have one. He'd never needed one. But because Darius's older brother Marcus had used someone for a contract dispute 2 years ago and said she was sharp and honest about what things would cost. Her name was Renata Cole, and she had an office in Newark, and when Ethan called, she was between clients and picked up herself. He explained it in under 3 minutes. She listened without interrupting. "Don't go in without me," she said. "Do not answer any questions without me present. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good. Can you be at my office at 3? "Yes." "Bring every document you have related to this job. Contracts, texts, emails, anything." He drove back to Millhaven first. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone and his laptop and pulled together everything: the text message chain with Claire going back 8 weeks, the brief email exchange about the wiring harness order where he'd CC'd himself, the photograph he'd taken of Richard Ashford's notepad on day 3 because he'd wanted a backup copy in case something happened to the original, and the notes he'd been keeping in a plain spiral notebook that lived in his toolbox. He also pulled up his bank statements. Every payment from Claire had come through a standard electronic transfer, properly documented, with a clear memo line that read, "Vehicle restoration, Ashford and his name." 12 payments over 8 weeks, each one corresponding to an invoice he'd emailed from his shop's account. He printed everything. He drove to Newark, sat across from Renata Cole, who was 50 and wore reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and laid out every document on her conference table. She went through them in 20 minutes without saying much. When she finished, she looked at him over the glasses. "This is a clean paper trail," she said. "The invoices are consistent, the payments match, the message history is extensive and entirely mundane. There's nothing here that looks like anything except exactly what it is." "That's because it is exactly what it is," Ethan said. "I know. I'm telling you that's a good thing." She pushed the glasses up. "The article mentioned confidential documents. Do you have any idea what they're referring to?" "No, there are no documents in that garage except automotive notes. I've never been in the main house beyond the front entry." "Have you ever photographed anything at the estate other than car parts?" "I took a picture of the notepad. Richard Ashford's restoration notes. For backup." "Where is that?" "On my phone, in the camera roll." "Good. That's explainable. Do you know anyone who might want to frame this as something it isn't?" He thought about Derek Holt, which was the first time he thought about Holt specifically, though he'd felt the shape of something like Holt for weeks. He told Renata about the toolbox search, about the way the gate procedures had tightened without explanation, about Claire's comment that she thought she knew where the article was coming from. Renata listened to all of it. "Okay," she said. "We go in, you answer clearly and factually. We offer to provide everything you've brought today. If they have something specific, we find out what it is. If they don't, this is a fishing expedition, and we're cooperative and give them nothing to pull on." She looked at him steadily. "Don't speculate. Don't fill silences. Don't explain more than they ask for. Answer the question and stop." "Okay," he said. "And Ethan." She leaned forward slightly. "Whatever you're feeling right now, frustrated, angry, scared, leave it in the parking lot." He sat with that for a second. "I've got a daughter," he said. "They mentioned her in the article." Renata's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "I read that," she said quietly. "That was deliberate, and it was ugly, and if this goes somewhere actionable, we'll address it. Right now, parking lot." He nodded. They went in at 4:30. Detective Marlins was a compact man in his mid-40s with the efficient, undramatic manner of someone who'd been in interview rooms for 20 years and had stopped needing to perform seriousness. He had 2 folders on the table and a recorder. He stated the date and those present, and then he looked at Ethan and said, "Mr. Holloway, we've received a complaint alleging that you removed or copied confidential documents from the Ashford estate during the period of your employment there. Can you tell me what access you had to the property?" Ethan told him, calmly, chronologically, specifically. The garage. The covered walkway he used to access it from the parking area. The one time he'd been in the front room of the main house. He described the garage's contents. He described his work. He described the documentation he'd kept. Marlins asked whether he'd photographed any documents. "1," Ethan said. "Richard Ashford's handwritten restoration notes. I photographed them to have a backup copy. Here's the photo." He showed Renata first, who nodded, and then turned the phone toward Marlins. It was clearly a picture of handwritten automotive notes, part numbers, measurements, the name of a carburetor specialist. Marlins looked at it. Why photograph them? Because they're the only existing record of the work he did on the car. If something happened to the notepad, I'd lose that information. It's standard practice. I do it on complex restoration jobs. Did you share this photo with anyone? No. Have you shared any information about the Ashford family's affairs with any outside party? No. Any financial information, business plans, estate documents? No. He said it the same way each time, flat and final, without the defensive edge that would have made it sound like protest. Marlins asked whether Ethan had a prior relationship with anyone who might have an interest in Ashford Group business, whether he'd been approached by any journalists or competitors, whether he'd been offered money for information. No, and no. Renata provided the printed documents, the invoices, the payment records, the text message history. She noted clearly and without theatrical emphasis that if the complaint had alleged specific documents or specific dates, she'd want to know what they were so her client could respond to something concrete rather than a general allegation. Marlins looked at the documents. He was quiet for a moment. The complaint was filed by an attorney representing Ashford Group's board-level security committee, he said, choosing his words with the care of someone reading from something internal. The specific allegation is that a USB drive containing estate planning documents and internal financial projections was removed from a secure location in the residence during the period corresponding to your presence on the property. Ethan looked at him. I've never been in a secure location in the residence. I've never held a USB drive that belonged to the Ashford family. I don't own a USB drive. I use cloud storage for my records. Marlins made a note. Can we examine your phone? Renata said they'd provide a voluntary consent to search his phone's files with any forensic process that didn't require leaving the phone overnight. Marlins said they'd need to discuss that with the DA's office. The meeting ended with Ethan's full cooperation documented, his records on the table, and no arrest, but also no clearance. He walked out into the parking lot in the early dark of a November evening and stood next to his truck and felt the full weight of it land on him. They'd put Maya in the article. Not by name, but as his young daughter, a detail included to make him sympathetic to some readers and predatory to others, depending on how they read it. The implication being that he'd cultivated access to the Ashford family while being a struggling single father, which could mean either that desperation had made him dishonest or that he'd been strategic from the beginning. He called Mrs. Pacheco. Maya was fine. She'd been at school, didn't know anything about it, and Mrs. Pacheco had kept the TV off. He said he'd be home by 7 and asked her not to let Maya see any news. Then he sat in the truck for a while. He was not by nature someone who needed to talk through things to process them. He usually processed alone through the physical act of working, the thinking that happened alongside his hands. But he'd just come out of an interview room where he'd kept his voice flat for 90 minutes and held himself completely still, and now there was nowhere to put the anger. Because it was anger, specifically. Not fear, though there was some of that. Not confusion about what had happened. He understood very clearly what had happened. Someone had decided he was a threat, and because they had resources and he didn't, they'd use those resources to make a version of him that was easier to eliminate than the real one. He understood how that worked. He just hadn't thought it would work on him, and being wrong about that was its own separate thing to be angry about. His phone rang. Claire. How did it go? I'm outside, he said. They have a complaint from your board-level security committee about a USB drive. Something from a secure location in the residence. A pause. Then, very quietly, that doesn't exist. I know it doesn't. There's no secure location access during your visits. You've never been in the East Wing. You've never been in my father's study. You've never... She stopped. This was manufactured. Yes, he said. The silence on the line was different from Claire's usual silences. There was something in it that sounded like the moment before someone makes a decision they can't take back. I know who did this, she said. I've known since this morning, but I wanted to be sure before I said it. Holt, Ethan said. Another pause. How do you know that name? I don't, really. I just had a shape in my head and it needed a name. Gerald Price didn't feel like the architect of this. He's too cautious. Someone used him. Who's Holt? She told him. 7 years with the company, 6 on the board's strategic committee, her mother's trusted lieutenant during the transition after Richard's death. A man who had, in Claire's assessment, spent the last 18 months positioning himself to effectively co-manage the company alongside Margaret, who was grieving and exhausted enough that she'd allowed it or hadn't noticed it happening until it was far along. He needs my mother afraid and alone, Claire said. If she reconciles with me, if she starts trusting her own judgment again, he loses the leverage he spent years building. She stopped. You were something he didn't have a category for. You weren't a scheme. You didn't have an agenda. That made you more dangerous to him than someone who did. I'm a mechanic, Ethan said. You helped my mother talk about my father for the first time since the funeral, Claire said. You did that by just showing up and being honest for 3 weeks. Do you understand how threatening that is to someone who depends on her staying closed off? He understood it in the abstract. In the specific, standing in a parking lot in Newark, Ohio with a police interview behind him and his daughter's school day starting in 13 hours, it felt less philosophical. What are you going to do? He asked. What I should have done 6 months ago, she said. There was something in her voice that was different, not harder exactly, but more anchored. Like a decision had been made and the making of it had stabilized something. I'm going to the security team directly. Not Price, not the board committee Holt has influence over. The estate's own security manager. His name is Calvin Dries, and he reports directly to my mother. I'm going to ask him to pull every camera log from the garage and the residence entry points for every day you were on the property. And you think he will? He will because I'm asking him to, and because he's the one person in that organization who isn't compromised. A pause. He liked my father. He won't like this. Claire, Ethan said. Yeah. Be careful. If Holt did this once, he'll know you're moving against him. I know. She was quiet for a second. I'm not as careful as I used to be. I told you that would happen. He almost said something. Didn't. Go home to Maya, she said. I'll call you tomorrow. He drove home. Maya was at the kitchen table with a volcano diagram she'd clearly spent the better part of the afternoon on, colored in with careful attention. She looked up when he came in, read his face the way she read his face, without drama, directly, and said, You okay? Long day, he said. Mrs. Pacheco made us soup. Is there any left? Lots. He ate the soup. He helped Maya finish the diagram. He got her to bed and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and looked at the article again, this time reading all of it, every word, the way you press a bruise to understand exactly where it is. The article mentioned his shop's Google reviews, which were good. It mentioned his mortgage, which it had no business knowing about, but which was a matter of public record. It mentioned that he had been hired without a written contract, which was technically true, because Claire had been working toward a formal agreement when Holt's move preempted the timeline. That detail was doing specific work in the article. It was there to make the arrangement look informal and therefore suspicious. He closed the laptop and went to bed and lay in the dark and did not sleep particularly well. The next morning, Calvin Dries pulled the camera logs. He was 61, had been head of Ashford Estate Security for 14 years, and operated with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that his job was to find the truth of a situation, not the version of it that was convenient. He didn't tell Derek Holt he was doing this. He didn't tell Gerald Price. He told Margaret Ashford, who looked at him from across her desk when he brought her the request and said, Is Claire asking you to do this? Yes, ma'am. Do it, she said. The logs covered 43 days of Ethan's presence on the property. Every entry and exit time-stamped to the second. Every camera angle that covered the garage, the covered walkway, the parking area, and the residence entry points. Calvin Dries went through them himself with another member of his team, and what they found was unambiguous. Ethan Holloway had entered the property through the gate, driven to the garage, parked, and worked in the garage. He had used the covered walkway twice, once in each direction. He had never entered the main residence beyond the front foyer, where a camera clearly showed him accepting coffee from a household staff member on day 11 and immediately returning to the garage. There was no visit to any secure location. There was no east wing. There was no study. There was no USB drive. What the logs also showed on day 31 was Derek Holt entering the residence at 7:18 in the morning, 2 hours before anyone else arrived. The camera at the East Wing access point showed him entering. The camera in the hallway outside Richard Ashford's study showed him entering that room with a laptop bag. He was in the study for 11 minutes. When he left, the bag looked slightly different, not dramatically. It was the kind of difference you'd miss if you weren't specifically looking. Calvin Dries was specifically looking. He had a forensics firm that the estate retained for cyber incidents. He called them that morning. By afternoon, they had confirmed that a USB drive containing estate planning documents had been accessed from the study computer on the morning of day 31. The access log showed a file transfer to an external device. The device wasn't registered to anyone on the authorized list. Day 31 was the same day the complaint had been filed against Ethan Holloway. Dries brought this to Margaret Ashford at 5 in the afternoon. He laid it out on her desk in a clear sequence. The camera logs, the access records, the forensics report. He didn't editorialize. He let the documents speak. Margaret sat behind her desk and looked at the documents for a long time. "He filed the complaint," she said finally. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Against Mr. Holloway?" "Yes." "Using a theft, he committed himself." "That's what the evidence indicates." She was quiet for another long moment. When she spoke, her voice was what it always was, even, controlled, but it was costing more than usual. "How long have I been trusting this man?" 7 years, Dries said. "Did he take the documents from my husband's study?" "The file transfer record suggests so. Yes." She didn't say anything for a while. Dries waited. He'd worked for this family long enough to understand when waiting was the correct thing to do. "Get me my daughter," Margaret said. Claire came in 20 minutes later. She'd been in the west sitting room. She'd known something was happening from the moment Dries had gone into her mother's office, and she'd been waiting with her phone in her hand and the specific still patience of someone who has gotten this far by keeping themselves together. She sat across from her mother. Dries had left the documents on the desk. They sat together and read through them, and somewhere in that reading, something happened that had nothing to do with Derek Holt or USB drives or camera logs. Something that had been broken for a long time, or not broken exactly, but misaligned the way an engine runs rough when the timing is off, shifted slightly toward correct. "I made him too powerful," Margaret said. Claire didn't say yes. "You did." She said, "He used something real. You were grieving. He was there." "That's a generous read of my mistakes." "It's accurate," Claire said. "There's a difference." They looked at each other across the desk, across the documents, across 3 years of a grief that had made Margaret grip tighter and made Claire pull further away, each of them doing the thing that felt like survival, and not understanding that the other one felt the same way. "I need to call the lawyer," Margaret said. "I know." "And you need to call Mr. Holloway." "I know that too." But Margaret reached across the desk and touched her daughter's hand. Briefly, not a prolonged thing, not a dramatic gesture, just a hand covering a hand for a few seconds, and then she withdrew it and picked up her phone. Claire sat there for just a moment, then she called Ethan. He was in the shop, elbow deep in the Silverado's differential, which had developed a new problem on top of the original problem, which was how differentials worked when they'd been ignored long enough. He had grease on his face, and the phone wedged between his ear and shoulder. "They have it," Claire said. "Have what?" "Everything. Camera logs, access records, forensics on a file transfer. Dries found the whole thing. It wasn't you, and there's documentation proving it wasn't you, and the same documentation shows who it actually was." She paused. "It was Holt. He took documents from my father's study and filed the complaint against you with evidence from his own theft." Ethan set down the wrench he was holding. He stood up from the differential. "Are you telling me the case against me is going away yet?" he said. "My mother's lawyers are calling the DA's office this evening. Dries is cooperating fully. I'd expect the complaint to be formally withdrawn within 48 hours. He leaned against the truck. The shop was empty. Darius had gone home an hour ago, and the overhead lights made everything flat and bright. He was suddenly aware of how tired he was. Not the kind of tired that a night's sleep fixes, but the other kind. The one that accumulates over weeks of holding yourself together under pressure. Claire, he said. Yeah. Thank you. You don't need to each. I'm not thanking you for fixing it, he said. I'm thanking you for not waiting to fix it. You could have waited. You could have asked me to be patient, let things play out, kept your head down. You didn't. She was quiet for a moment. I've kept my head down for a long time, she said. It turns out it doesn't actually protect anything. It just makes you smaller. He didn't respond to that directly because it was true and she didn't need him to confirm it. My mother wants you to know, Claire said, that she understands this was her failure as much as anything else. She said she would tell you herself, but she thought it might be easier to hear it this way first. He thought about Margaret sitting across from him in the garage, her teacup in her hand, saying, I feel guilty. About how long she'd been carrying fear like a navigational tool, using it to steer everything, not noticing what it was steering her away from. Tell her it's okay, he said. Is it? He thought about the article, about Maya's school day, about the parking lot outside the sheriff's office, and the way the dark had felt when he stood in it. Not entirely, he said honestly. But it will be. 2 days later, the complaint was formally withdrawn. The DA's office closed the file. The same Paul Rennick who'd written the original article published a brief follow-up. 4 paragraphs, buried on the second page of the digital edition, noting that the complaint against the Millhaven contractor had been found to be without merit following an internal security review. It didn't mention Derek Holt by name. That story was still forming, working its way through the legal channels that moved slowly and thoroughly. Ethan read the follow-up at the kitchen table in the morning before Maya woke up. He read it twice. Then he folded the laptop closed and went to make coffee. Because the coffee didn't make itself, and there was work today, and the Jaguar was still in the garage in Granville waiting for him, the engine not yet finished, the carburetor not yet reinstalled. The car still paused at the place where Richard Ashford had stopped 3 years ago. He was almost at the garage when he remembered something Derek Holt hadn't counted on. Something nobody had counted on because it wasn't strategic and it wasn't planned. It was just what happened when you drove past someone on a cold highway and couldn't quite make yourself keep going. He changed a tire once. That was all. And somehow everything else had come from that. The withdrawal of this complaint didn't make the noise go away immediately. That wasn't how these things worked, and Ethan knew it even if he'd hoped otherwise. The original article had run in the Columbus Business Journal and been picked up by 2 regional aggregators and 1 national small business news outlet that had framed it as a cautionary tale about the risks of informal hiring arrangements. Between them, those 4 pieces had been read by several thousand people, a significant portion of whom lived within driving distance of Millhaven. The 4-paragraph follow-up ran in the Columbus Business Journal only, wasn't picked up anywhere, and was read by considerably fewer people. That arithmetic was just what it was. Ethan understood it the way he understood that a car with a bent frame could be straightened but would never be exactly what it was before. You worked with what you had. What he had, in the 10 days following the withdrawal, was a shop that was quieter than usual. Not empty. The regulars came. Mrs. Garland brought her Corolla in for an oil change and stayed for 40 minutes talking about her granddaughter's soccer team. And the Silverado's owner picked up his truck and seemed satisfied. But quieter. 2 new customers who'd called before the article to ask about work didn't call back to confirm. A fleet account with a local plumbing company that had been in early conversations went silent. Ethan didn't follow up. He wasn't sure what he'd say. Darius noticed it by the second week and had the good sense not to say anything directly, which Ethan appreciated. He noticed Darius working harder than usual, staying late, being meticulous about the small things, the way a young person does when they're trying to shore up something without being asked to. Ethan noticed it and said nothing and was quietly grateful for it. He drove to Granville on Tuesdays and Thursdays now, down from the near-daily visits of the previous month. The investigation had put a necessary pause on the work, and resuming felt different. Not wrong, but loaded in a way the early weeks hadn't been. Like the garage had acquired a different weight. He went anyway because the car was still there and still needed finishing, and because stopping would have meant something he didn't want it to mean. On the first Tuesday back, he reinstalled the rebuilt carburetor. It was the piece Richard Ashford had sent out to Callie Marsh in Columbus before the diagnosis had changed everything. He'd gotten it back in perfect condition and then set it on the workbench and apparently not touched it again. Ethan had examined it weeks ago and found the work immaculate. Every jet cleaned, every needle set, the float level exactly right. He just had to put it back. He took his time with it, lined up the mounting studs, set the gasket, torqued it down in sequence, connected the fuel line and the vacuum lines in the order Richard's notes specified. It was detailed work that required full attention, and he gave it that. And the 2 hours it took were 2 hours in which he thought about almost nothing else, which was the specific mercy of technical work when your life has been complicated. Claire came in around noon with sandwiches. She'd been doing that more since the investigation. Not more frequently exactly, but differently, with less of the professional composure she'd worn like a uniform in the early weeks. She set the sandwiches on the workbench and looked at the engine. "You put it back," she said. "Carburetor." "Yes." "Does it look right?" "It looks exactly right. The woman who rebuilt it knew what she was doing." Claire sat on the stool. She looked tired. Not physically tired. She was put together. Her clothes were right. Her posture was what it always was. But there was something behind her eyes that had been there since the investigation that wasn't entirely clearing. The kind of tired that comes from having been angry for a long time and not quite knowing what to do with the absence of the thing you were angry at. "The board met yesterday," she said. "How'd it go?" "Derek resigned." She said it flatly. "His lawyer negotiated the terms. He doesn't admit to anything in the separation agreement, which I fought and lost, but the documents Dries found are in our possession, and we retain the right to cooperate with any external investigation." She paused. "Which my mother's legal team made very clear we intend to do if one materializes." "Is one going to?" "The DA's office has the forensics report. Whether they pursue it depends on things I can't control." She picked up her sandwich. "What I can tell you is that he's gone from the company and he's not coming back, and every board member who'd been deferring to him for the last 2 years now understands exactly why they were doing that." "How's your mother handling it?" It was quiet for a moment. "She's angry," she said, and the word came out with a kind of specificity that suggested she'd thought about how to characterize it. Not at herself yet, mostly at him. But underneath that, I think there's something harder that she's going to have to get to eventually. "That she let it happen," Ethan said. "That she needed it to happen. That being afraid for long enough made her easier to manage than she ever realized." Claire looked at the carburetor, the careful chrome of it sitting in the engine bay exactly where it belonged. "She asked me the other day whether I thought my father knew. About Holt, I mean, whether he saw it and didn't say anything." "What'd you tell her?" "I told her I didn't think my father missed much. But I also told her it didn't matter because whatever he saw or didn't see, the problem wasn't Holt. The problem was the space he was able to occupy, and that space came from grief." She set down her sandwich. She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't disagree. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and sat on the stool next to hers. "That's probably as honest as a conversation gets." "It's the most honest one we've had since he died," Claire said, "which is not a great record over 3 years, but it's something." They ate in the quiet of the garage, the two of them on adjacent stools, the Jaguar sitting open and patient in front of them. Outside, the light was the flat white of mid-December, the kind that made everything look still. "I want to talk to you about something," Claire said. "Okay?" "The shop." He looked at her. "I know you're behind on the lease. I know the last few weeks have cost you accounts." She kept her voice even and direct, which he'd come to understand was not distance, but effort. The effort of someone who'd learned that the best way to say difficult things was to say them clearly. "I want to offer you a partnership." "Claire, let me finish. Not charity, not a gift. A business arrangement with real terms that a lawyer reviews from your side and mine before either of us signs anything." She met his eyes. "The Ashford Group has logistics operations across 4 states. Those fleets need maintenance contracts. Right now, we use 3 different regional providers, and the coordination it's inefficient, and the quality is inconsistent, and I've been meaning to consolidate it for months." Ethan said nothing. He was listening with the specific attention he used when a customer described a sound an engine was making, trying to hear what was actually being said rather than what he expected to hear. "You'd need to expand," she said. "More bays, more staff. The contract would be enough to justify the capital investment, and the volume would be enough to give you stable revenue that doesn't depend on whoever in Millhaven needs a brake job this week." She paused. "I've already talked to 2 attorneys about the structure. It's clean, it's fair. If you walk away from it in 2 years because it's not working, you walk away no worse than you started." "Why me?" he said. She looked at him. "Because you do good work and you tell the truth, and those are apparently hard to find in combination." A pause. "And because you deserve something that isn't a constant scramble, and I can offer you that without it costing me anything I can't afford." "That last part," he said. "What about it?" "You don't owe me anything, Claire." "I know I don't." She said it without defensiveness. "This isn't about debt. Debt would mean I'm making this up to you. I'm not. You didn't do anything that requires making up. You helped me on a highway and then you did honest work here. Those things happened." She looked at the engine. "This is about the fact that I have a resource and you have a need, and the fit is real. That's business. That's how it should work." He sat with it. He thought about the legal pad on his kitchen table, the numbers he moved around trying to find a new arrangement, the dental appointment, the lease, the fleet account that had gone quiet, the fact that Darius was good and getting better and deserved to work somewhere that wasn't perpetually one slow month from a hard decision. "I want a lawyer," he said. "I said that. And I want real terms, not favorable terms, not adjusted terms. Market rate for the contract and honest margins on the arrangement. That's what I'm offering. And if the work isn't right, you tell me. You don't manage around it to protect my feelings." "Ethan," she said, with a faint edge of impatience that was actually more reassuring than patience would have been. "I have run strategic operations for a company worth $3 billion. I'm not going to manage around your feelings." He almost smiled. Not quite. "Okay. Okay, you'll consider it?" "Okay, I'll consider it," he said. "Send me the terms when they're ready, and I'll have someone look at them." She nodded. She picked up her sandwich again. He picked up his. After a moment, she said, "My father would have done exactly this, offered you the partnership. He used to say that if you find someone who does what they say and says what they mean, you build a structure around that and stop looking." "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Ethan said. "He was." She said it simply, without performance. "I'm glad you're finishing his car." They went back to eating, and the garage was quiet, and outside the December light did what December light in Ohio does, which is not very much at all, but it was enough. The terms arrived by email 4 days later, attached as a formal document with the Ashford Group's header at the top, and a note from Claire saying she'd had 2 separate lawyers review it, and that Renata Cole's contact information was already in the file if Ethan wanted to use someone he trusted. He called Renata. She read the document while he waited and then called him back in 2 hours. "It's fair," she said. "Market rate fleet maintenance contract, 3-year initial term with renewal options, revenue guarantee on minimum volume that would cover your current fixed costs with margin, no exclusivity clause, you can take other clients, and a clean exit provision if either party terminates with 90 days notice." A pause. "The only thing I'd push on is the liability language in Section 4, which is standard but slightly tilted toward them. I'd want a carve-out for pre-existing equipment failures." "Can you draft that?" "Already did. I'll send it to you." He sent Renata's revision to Claire's lawyer, who came back within 24 hours accepting the carve-out and noting 2 minor clarifications. Renata said the clarifications were reasonable. Ethan signed. He was at the kitchen table when he did it, on a Thursday evening after Maya had gone to bed. He initialed each page the way Renata had instructed and signed the final page and scanned it with his phone and sent it to 3 people simultaneously: Renata, Claire's lawyer, and Claire herself. He sat at the table after. The kitchen was quiet the way it got after 9 o'clock. The refrigerator hummed the loudest thing in the room. He looked at the counter where he'd eaten cold chicken soup 3 months ago, coming home from a highway in the rain. He didn't feel the way he thought he'd feel. He'd imagined relief as something larger, something that announced itself. What he actually felt was a kind of settling, like a car dropping off a jack, but not dramatic, just the weight landing where it belonged. He went to bed. The next morning, he told Darius. Darius was under the hood of an Audi that had come in the day before with a coolant leak, and he straightened up with the specific alertness of someone whose name has just been said with a tone he hasn't heard before. "There's going to be work," Ethan said. "Real volume. A fleet maintenance contract. It's going to mean more bays and more hands." He looked at Darius steadily. "I'm going to need a shop manager, someone I trust to run the floor when I'm not here." Darius stared at him. "Me? Unless you know someone better qualified?" "I'm 22. You've been doing this work for 3 years, and you know what you don't know, which is more valuable than it sounds." Ethan kept his voice even, not performing encouragement. "I'm not offering you something you're not ready for. I'm offering you something that's going to require you to grow into it. Those are different things." Darius looked at the Audi. He looked at Ethan. He had the expression of someone who had been hoping for something for a while and was now finding out it was real and was not entirely sure what to do with that. "Okay," he said. "Good," Ethan said. "Fix the coolant leak." Darius turned back to the hood. Then he turned back around. "Did something happen, like specifically?" "I signed a contract last night." "With the Ashford people?" "Yes." Darius nodded slowly. "After everything that happened." "After everything that happened," Ethan confirmed. Darius turned to the Audi again. A moment later, not looking up. "That's kind of a serious thing to do after someone tried to frame you." "It is," Ethan agreed. "Does it feel weird?" Ethan thought about that. "It feels like the right thing," he said, "which sometimes feels weird when you're not used to it." Darius made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. They went back to work. Margaret Ashford called that afternoon. Not her assistant, not Gerald Price, not a relay through Claire, her directly, from a number Ethan didn't have but recognized from the Granville area code. "Mr. Holloway." "Ethan," he said. A brief pause. "Ethan." She said his name with the precision of someone correcting themselves on a thing they'd decided to correct. "I understand you signed the contract." "This morning." "Good." She paused again, and in the pause was something that in any other voice Ethan might have called awkward, though awkward didn't quite fit Margaret Ashford. Uncomfortable, maybe. The specific discomfort of someone who has something to say that doesn't come naturally to them. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for sending Gerald Price. I stand by the instinct, if not the execution. But for what Derek did, and for the degree to which my need to keep everything locked down created the conditions for what he did." She stopped. "That's a roundabout way of saying I should have looked more carefully at who I was trusting and less carefully at who I was suspicious of." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was sitting in the shop office, the door to the floor open, the sound of Darius and the Audi faint behind him. "I appreciate that," he said. "It means something." "It's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's a start." Another pause. "Claire tells me you're a good listener." "I try to be." "She said you listened to me in the garage, the things I said about Richard." "You needed to say them," Ethan said. "I happened to be there." "Don't undersell that," Margaret said with a directness that cut through any deflection he might have tried. "There are 100 people in my life, and none of them heard me say those things. You were in my garage for 10 days before I said them to you." She paused. "That's not about you happening to be there. That's about the kind of person you are." He didn't have a response to that. He sat with it. "The car," she said then, and her voice changed register slightly, smaller, less executive, more something else. "How long?" "Before it's done?" "Yes." 4 to 6 weeks, he said. "I'd say 4 if everything goes right. It won't all go right, so probably 5. "Will it run?" "It'll run," he said. "When I'm finished, it'll run the way it was supposed to run in 1967. A silence on the line. "Richard wanted to drive it in spring," she said. "That was the plan. Finish it over the winter and take it out in April when the roads were clear." "It'll be ready before April," Ethan said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Thank you, Ethan." "I'll let you know when we're close," he said. She said goodbye and hung up. He sat in the office for a moment, looking at the wall where he'd tacked a printout of the contract terms. Not the full document, just the key numbers, so he could see them from his desk every day and make them real to himself. The month that followed was the strangest of the whole experience, because the crisis had passed, and the new arrangement was settling into place, and the work in Granville was entering its final stages. And without the acute drama of the previous weeks, Ethan found himself living in a kind of ordinary that felt unfamiliar. Things were simply getting better. Slowly, without fanfare, in the particular unglamorous way that things actually get better when they do. The fleet contract brought its first work in the third week of December. 6 trucks from the Ashford Group's Columbus logistics hub needing scheduled maintenance. Darius coordinated the intake while Ethan was in Granville, and when Ethan called to check in, Darius described the logistics with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for a problem scaled to his capability. The Millhaven shop started to fill again in the way it had been before the article. Not roaringly, not overnight, but consistently. The plumbing company's fleet manager called back apologetically in the second week of January. Ethan took the call without making anything of the gap. They needed reliable work done. He could do it. That was sufficient. He also quietly had a conversation with Renata Cole about the article and the 4-paragraph follow-up, and whether the disproportion between them created any legal exposure for the publication or the unnamed source. Renata said possibly, depending on what could be traced and proved, and that they should preserve everything they had and revisit it once the Holt matter resolved more fully. Ethan agreed and moved on. What he didn't do, in any of this, was tell Maya the specifics. She was 7 and she was sharp, and she'd noticed things. The tension in him during the worst weeks, the phone calls that pulled him out of rooms, the mornings he'd been short-tempered in a way that wasn't like him. She'd asked once, directly, whether he was in trouble, and he told her the truth in the version that was appropriate for 7. Someone had said something untrue about him, and he'd shown the truth, and it was getting sorted out. She'd accepted this with the practical confidence of a child who trusts the adult in her life to handle things, which was both a gift and a responsibility Ethan felt acutely. When he told her, in early January, that the shop was getting bigger, that there would be more work and more people, and that things were more stable, she looked at him across the breakfast table and said, "Is this because of the tire lady?" He almost laughed. "The tire lady has a name." "Claire," Maya said with the patience of someone who knows that and was using the other thing for a reason. "Is it because of her?" "It's connected," he said, in a complicated way. "Do you like her?" Maya asked, with the directness that children deploy when they've decided a question is important enough to ask straight. Ethan was quiet for a second. "I respect her," he said. "She's a good person." "That's not the same thing as liking her." "It's part of it," he said. Maya considered this. "She gave you a business thing?" "A contract. Yes." "And that helps us?" "It helps us significantly." She nodded slowly. "Can I see the car now?" "The Jaguar?" "You said maybe," she reminded him. "That was a long time ago." It had been 10 weeks. "Yeah," he said. "I'll see if I can arrange it." He mentioned it to Claire the next time he was in Granville, almost casually, expecting to need to explain the context. Claire said immediately, "Bring her Saturday. I'll have something for her in the kitchen first. One of the staff makes these ridiculous chocolate cookies, and Maya seems like she'd have opinions about cookies." "How do you know she'd have opinions?" "She's your daughter," Claire said. "She has opinions about everything." He didn't argue with that. He told Maya on Thursday. She was characteristically restrained about it for approximately 4 seconds, and then asked whether the car was really green, and whether the engine was loud, and whether the garage was big, and whether there would be dogs. "There might be dogs," he said. "I've never seen dogs, but it's a big property." "I hope there are dogs," she said. There were not, as it turned out, dogs. But there were the cookies, which were large and dark with sea salt on top, and Maya ate 2 of them sitting at the kitchen island while one of the Ashford household staff, named Denise, showed her pictures of the estate's history on an iPad with the patient enthusiasm of someone who actually liked children. Claire sat at the other end of the island with coffee, watching Maya with an expression that was something between warmth and a kind of wistfulness that she didn't bother to hide. Ethan watched Claire watching Maya and thought about what it meant to have spent 30 years being careful about who you let see you. Then Margaret came downstairs. She came in her casual clothes, which for Margaret meant slacks and a fine knit sweater, and she stopped in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. Her daughter at one end of the island, a 7-year-old at the other, Denise with the iPad, cookies on the counter. Something moved across her face. Maya looked up. "Hi," Maya said with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to make introductions complicated. "I'm Maya. My dad fixes your car." Margaret came to the island. She looked at Maya with the same direct weight she gave everything, and then she pulled out the stool next to her and sat down. "I know who you are," she said. "Your father talks about you." "He talks about me to you." Maya looked surprised, then pleased. Then she tried not to show she was pleased. "He does," Margaret said. "He mentioned volcanoes." Maya looked at Ethan across the kitchen. He raised an eyebrow. "I'm interested in volcanoes," Maya told Margaret, with some dignity. "I know, he said you're tracking global volcanic activity for a school project." "It's not exactly a school project," Maya said. "It's more of a personal research interest that I'm also doing for school." Margaret almost smiled. Not quite, but it was there at the edge of her mouth. "I see the distinction." "My teacher doesn't," Maya said. This time Margaret did smile, and it was brief and genuine, and Ethan noticed Claire notice it. A small catch in Claire's expression, something registering. They stayed for 2 hours. Maya ate a third cookie and saw the garage and stood next to the Jaguar, with her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of intense restraint that Ethan recognized as her not touching something she very badly wanted to touch. "You can look," he said. "The engine," she said reverently. "The engine." She leaned in over the fender and looked at the 4.2-liter inline-6 in its bay, the new wiring neat, the rebuilt carburetor in place, the whole assembly beginning to look like something that belonged together rather than something mid-dissection. She studied it for a long moment. "It's complicated," she said. "It is." "Did you figure it all out?" "Most of it," he said. "There's always something you don't expect." She straightened up and looked at him. "Are you proud of it?" He thought about that honestly. "I'll be proud when it runs," he said. "Right now I'm just in it." She nodded like that made sense to her. It probably did. She'd been doing things for long enough to know the difference between being in the middle of something and being done with it. On the drive home, she was quiet for a while, watching the winter fields go past. "I like them," she said eventually. "Who?" "Claire and the old lady. Her name is Margaret." "I know. I like her. She's not fake nice." A pause. "Some adults talk to you like you're a dog. She talked to me like I was a person." "She talks to everyone like they're a person," Ethan said. "It's one of her better qualities." "Does she know that?" "I think she's figuring it out," he said. Maya looked out the window. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are things actually okay now? Like, really?" He drove for a moment. The road was straight and gray under a pale sky, the fields on either side flat and frost-silvered, the kind of landscape that makes the distance look reachable. "Yeah," he said. "Really?" She settled back in her seat. "Okay," she said with the ease of a child releasing something she'd been holding. "Good." He drove. The heater ran. Outside, the Ohio winter was exactly what it was, cold and flat and not especially beautiful. But it was manageable, and the road was clear, and he could see far enough ahead that he wasn't worried about what was coming. That was most of what he'd ever wanted, not certainty, just visibility, just enough of the road showing to keep moving. He had that now. The shop was still behind him in some ways and ahead of him in others, and the car in Granville was close but not finished, and his daughter was 7 and would be 8 in April, and the world was going to keep being complicated in whatever way the world decided to be complicated next. But tonight, there was a contract on his wall, and a partnership being built on real terms, and a kid in the back seat who'd eaten 3 cookies and was already half asleep with her forehead against the cold window glass. He let her sleep. The last weeks of January came in hard and gray, the kind of cold that didn't fluctuate much, just sat on everything like a hand pressing down. Ethan drove to Granville on a Tuesday morning with ice on the truck's windshield that the defroster worked at for 20 minutes before giving up on the corners, and he drove the whole way with two small crescents of frost at the edges of his vision that he kept meaning to scrape and didn't. He had 4 weeks left on the Jaguar, maybe 5. He told Margaret 5 and was quietly working toward 4, not because anyone was pushing him, but because he'd been living with this engine long enough that finishing it had become something he wanted for its own sake. That happens sometimes with long jobs. You started caring about the thing independent of the contract. The suspension was the last major mechanical item. He'd been working through it in the previous 2 visits. New bushings throughout, rebuilt front uprights, the rear trailing arm bearings replaced with modern equivalents that would last longer than the originals without compromising the car's character. Character was a real thing in old cars. It wasn't mystical. It was the sum of the original engineers' decisions, the materials they used, the tolerances they held, and it could be preserved or it could be destroyed depending on how carefully you worked. Ethan worked carefully. He was pressing the last of the new front bushings into the lower control arm when Claire came in with coffee and the specific expression she wore when she had something to say that she was deciding how to say. He kept working. He'd learned that Claire's things came out better when they weren't forced. She sat on the stool. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Outside, the frost had settled on the garage's single high window and made the light inside diffuse and even. "The DA's office called my mother's lawyer yesterday," she said. He looked up. "They're moving forward with Holt," she said. "Theft, computer fraud, filing a false police report. The third charge is that one specifically about you, the false complaint." She paused. "His attorney is already talking about a plea. It probably won't go to trial." "Okay," Ethan said. "That's it? Okay." He set down the press and sat up, rolling his shoulders. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something more than okay." "I've been angry about it," he said. "I'm done being angry about it. What happens in the DA's office is what happens." He looked at her. "What I care about is that the record is clear. The complaint is withdrawn, the case against me is closed, and anyone who looks into it finds the truth. That's what I need." "You don't want him to, I don't know, suffer some consequence?" "I want him to have a consequence," Ethan said. "I want the consequence to be proportional, and I want it to happen through whatever process it happens through. I don't need to be there for it." He picked up the press again. "I've got a car to finish." Claire looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd stopped trying to fully interpret, because it contained too many things at once. Something like admiration, but sitting alongside something more complicated. The way a person looks at someone who keeps being different from what they expect and has stopped being surprised by that and started being something else. "Paul Rennick called me," she said. "The journalist. He wants to do a follow-up piece, a real one, not 4 paragraphs. The full story, Holt, the manufactured complaint, the camera footage, what the forensics showed." She paused. "He wants to talk to you." Ethan thought about the original article, his shop address, his mortgage, his daughter described as a biographical detail in someone else's narrative. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think the story should be told," she said. "And I think you should be the one to decide whether you want to be in it. Will it help the shop?" Visibility usually does, and the context reverses the original piece completely. Instead of a mechanic taking advantage of a family, it's a family insider manufacturing a crime to protect his own position. You're not the story. Holt is. She looked at him evenly. "But it's your life and your name, and I'm not going to tell you what to do with them." He worked the bushing press in silence for a moment, feeling the controlled resistance as the bushing seeded into the arm. When it clicked into place, he set the tool down and looked at what he'd done. Correct. Solid. "Call him," he said. "I'll talk to him." The interview with Rennick happened the following week, on a Thursday afternoon, at the shop in Millhaven. Rennick was a thin man with a good memory and the specific energy of a journalist who knew he'd gotten something wrong publicly and was trying to get it right with proportional thoroughness. He stayed 2 hours. He asked careful questions. He let Ethan's answers sit before asking the next one, which was a technique Ethan recognized as respect for the material. Darius stayed late, and puttered around the bays, being obviously present in the way young people are when they want to be witnesses to something historic but have too much dignity to say so. At the end, Rennick asked, "Is there anything you want people to know about the whole thing?" Ethan thought about it for long enough that the silence wasn't uncomfortable, just real. "I want people to know I didn't do anything heroic," he said. "I stopped for a flat tire because I was tired and I almost didn't, and then I did. Everything after that was just telling the truth when I was asked direct questions. That's not a story about me being remarkable. It's a story about what happens when you're just consistently honest in a situation where someone expected you to either be dishonest or be scared into silence." Rennick wrote that down. "And your daughter?" he asked. "The original article mentioned her." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, which he allowed himself and then released. "She's 8 in April," he said. "She's doing a personal research project on volcanic activity. She's fine." He paused. "Don't write much about her." "I wasn't going to," Rennick said, with the decency of someone who didn't need to be asked, but appreciated that Ethan asked directly. The piece ran 2 weeks later, on a Sunday, front page of the digital edition. It was long and specific and told the story in sequence, including a detailed account of how Holt had used access he'd cultivated over 7 years to position himself at the center of the Ashford Group's decision-making. It quoted Calvin Dries. It quoted Claire. It quoted Renata Cole on the swiftness with which the complaint had collapsed once the camera logs were reviewed. It quoted Ethan exactly as he'd spoken. The headline was, "Inside the Manufactured Crisis at the Ashford Estate and the Mechanic Who Didn't Blink." He didn't love the headline. He told Claire that on the phone when she called to ask if he'd seen it. "I didn't write the headline," she said. "I know. Does it bother you?" "The Mechanic Who Didn't Blink," he said. "I blinked. I stood in a parking lot outside the sheriff's office for 20 minutes trying to hold myself together." "That's not what not blinking means," she said. "I know what it means," he said. "I just think the truth is more accurate. The truth is that you went through something that would have broken most people, and you came out the other side without becoming someone you weren't," she said. "That's what the headline is trying to say in 5 words. He was quiet for a moment. "Okay?" he said. "It's a fine headline." She made a sound. "High praise." "Don't push it," he said. She almost laughed. He heard it, that almost. The piece did what Claire had said visibility usually does. The shop phone rang more in the 2 weeks after publication than it had in the 2 months before. Some of it was curiosity, people who'd read the article and wanted to put a face to the name, which translated to driving to Millhaven to see the place. Some of it was real. 3 new individual customers, 1 small fleet account from a landscaping company outside Newark, and a call from a logistics company in Zanesville that had seen the Ashford Group fleet contract mentioned in the article and wanted to know if Ethan was taking on additional work. He took the call. He was honest about his current capacity and his expansion timeline. He said he'd have more bays operational by April and he'd call them back then. They said that worked. He wrote the name in his notebook. Darius observed all of this with the quiet intensity of someone who understood what it meant. "We're actually going to need more people," Darius said one evening, after the last customer had left and they were closing up. "Yes," Ethan said. "I have 2 people in mind from the trade program. One of them is as good as I was when I started, which is, the other one's not as fast, but she's more thorough." "Thorough wins," Ethan said. "That's what I told her." Darius rolled the bay door down. "You want me to reach out?" "Next week, after I get back from Granville." "When are you finishing the Jaguar?" "Soon," Ethan said. "How soon?" He thought about the suspension, now complete. The engine, assembled and waiting. The interior, which he'd sent to an upholstery shop in Columbus 2 weeks ago. A recommendation from Claire, a craftsman named Orville who worked out of a garage not unlike Ethan's own and had been doing classic car interiors for 30 years. Orville had the seats and door panels and the dash covering, and he'd called 3 days ago to say he'd be done by the first week of February. 2 weeks, Ethan said. "Maybe less." Darius nodded. He had the expression of someone who understood that this ending was also a beginning of something else, which was exactly correct. February came in slightly less brutal than January, which in Ohio meant it was still cold, but the cold had lost its absolute conviction. The upholstery came back on a Wednesday. Orville delivered it himself in a van with careful padding and helped Ethan install it over the course of an afternoon. The new leather was the correct shade of tan, sourced from the same tannery in England that had supplied the original, and it went in clean and tight and smelled the way old cars are supposed to smell when the right person has worked on them. Ethan stepped back and looked at the interior. He looked at the door that sealed properly now, the seats that sat level and firm, the dashboard that was whole and unmarked. "Beautiful," Orville said from behind him, and Ethan agreed because it was accurate. The next 3 days were the engine, not assembly, that was mostly done, but preparation for the first start, the final checks that preceded turning a key for the first time after a long silence, valve clearances, ignition timing, oil pressure. He primed the oil system by pulling the coil wire and cranking the engine until the pressure gauge moved. He set the choke and the mixture. He went through the electrical connections a final time with the multimeter, checking each circuit against his notes. He found 2 things to correct. One was a loose ground connection at the rear lighting harness. Simple. The other was the idle speed screw, which was set fractionally too high from the carburetor rebuild. He adjusted both. He wrote both in his notes, the way Richard Ashford had written things in his notes, because this document was going to live with the car, and whoever worked on it next should know what the car's history was. On the final morning, he told Claire by text, "Ready when you want to be here. Bring your mother." She replied 20 minutes later, "Tomorrow, 10 a.m." He spent the rest of that day doing what you do when a large thing is about to happen and you don't want to make it larger by thinking about it too much. He swept the garage floor. He organized the tools he was taking back to Mill Haven into his box. He took Richard Ashford's notepad and his own pages of notes and laid them flat in a manila folder he'd brought, and he left the folder on the workbench where Claire would find it. He drove home. He made pasta. Maya was working on a school paper that had nominally been about weather patterns, but had somehow become specifically about the atmospheric effects of the 1815 Tambora eruption. And she talked him through the death toll and the resulting crop failures over dinner with the cheerful detachment of someone who finds history interesting rather than tragic. He asked clarifying questions and she answered them precisely, and he thought about how she'd been doing this. Educating him, really, in whatever she was currently absorbed by, since she was old enough to form complete sentences. "Dad," she said at the end, stacking her dishes. "Yeah." "Is tomorrow the car day? How'd you know about tomorrow?" "You texted Claire at dinner and then you were in a specific mood." "What mood?" She considered. "Not nervous, more like when you've been working on something for a long time and you're getting to the end of it. That's a precise description." "Can I come?" He thought about it. Margaret had said she was coming. Claire would be there. It was the moment the car had been waiting for, the moment Richard Ashford had been waiting for before the diagnosis had canceled the timeline. And it was a family moment as much as anything, and she was his, which meant she was part of what this had been about from the beginning, even when she wasn't in the room. "Yeah," he said, "you can come." She nodded, satisfied, and went to finish her paper. He drove to Granville the next morning with Maya in the passenger seat, which she'd recently been promoted to from the back seat with the specific solemnity of a child who understands that a threshold has been crossed. She had her seatbelt on and her hands in her lap, and she was watching the winter fields go past with the focused quiet of someone who was saving their energy for later. The gate guard waved them through. The maples along the drive were bare still, but the frost had lifted and the sky was higher than it had been for weeks. The kind of pale blue that suggests the season is not over, but is considering its options. Claire's car was already in the parking area, and next to it, Margaret's Range Rover. They walked to the garage together, Ethan and Maya, and Ethan pushed open the door. The Jaguar was exactly where he'd left it, centered in the bay under the overhead lights, the British racing green of its bodywork finally visible again in something close to its original depth. Orville had arranged for the chrome to be replated. He had a contact which Ethan had gratefully used, and it caught the light at the fenders and the bumper and along the door handles in thin, bright lines. Claire was standing at the rear of the car. Margaret was standing near the hood, not looking at Ethan when they came in, looking at the Jaguar. Her hands were at her sides. Maya stopped just inside the door and looked at the car the same way she'd looked at the engine weeks ago, with a stillness that in her meant genuine awe. "It's so green," she said quietly. "That's the original color," Ethan said. "British racing green." "Why is British racing green a thing?" "Long story," he said. "I'll tell you later." He walked to where Claire was standing. She looked at him with an expression that had something suspended in it, something that had been held back for months waiting for this specific morning. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "You okay?" She nodded. "I'm not sure I fully believed it until just now, seeing it like this." She looked at the whole car, the length of it, the proportions that made E-types distinctive from any angle, the way the nose came to its long point. He would have lost his mind. "In a good way," Ethan said. "Completely in a good way," she agreed. He walked to the driver's door and opened it. The hinges moved clean and quiet, and he sat in the driver's seat for the first time. The seat held him correctly. The steering wheel was where it should be. He looked at the instruments, which he'd tested individually but not all together, and he checked the oil pressure gauge and the temperature and the fuel level, which he'd filled the previous day. He looked up at Claire. "You want to do this?" he asked. "You can start it." She shook her head. "You finish it." He looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at him now, not at the car, and her expression was not the composed, controlled thing she'd walked in wearing. It was something more open than that. Something that had been open for a while, he suspected, and was just now visible to more people than it used to be. He put the key in. The key was original, a flat-sided metal thing that looked minimal by modern standards. He turned it one click to the right, the electrical system's coming alive. The warning lights on the gauge cluster, the fuel pump engaging, a sound from under the bonnet that was just the system pressurizing. He waited the appropriate seconds. Then he turned it fully. The starter motor engaged, a mechanical sound, purposeful, the engine rotating through its compression cycle once, twice. On the third compression, the 4.2-liter fired. It didn't fire dramatically. It didn't roar or bark or announce itself. It started the way a well-built engine starts, when everything has been done correctly. It caught, it smoothed, and within 5 seconds it was running at idle with a consistency that was almost conversational, a deep, even sound that filled the garage without overwhelming it. The kind of sound that a properly balanced inline-six makes when the carburetor is right and the timing is right and the valves are set and everything is sealed the way it should be. Ethan listened to it. He listened carefully, the way he'd been listening to engines his entire adult life, hearing the shape of the sound rather than just the volume. He heard no knock, no tick that wasn't the normal valve train, no misfire in the idle, no variation that suggested a problem. He watched the oil pressure gauge climb to where it belonged and stay there. He watched the temperature begin its slow rise toward operating. He put it in neutral and revved it once, briefly, not excessively, just enough to hear how it responded. It responded cleanly, the revs rising and falling without hesitation, the engine settling back to idle with immediate confidence. He turned to look at Claire. She had her hand over her mouth. Margaret was crying. Not loudly, not in any way that was for an audience, just silently, tears on her face, her hands clasped together in front of her, her composure entirely gone and apparently not something she was trying to recover. She was looking at the hood of the car the way people look at something they thought they'd lost. Maya was standing near the side wall with her arms crossed, watching everything with the wide-eyed precision of a child recording something she knows is important. Ethan got out of the car. He left the engine running. It sounded better with every passing minute, warming up, finding its rhythm. And he walked around to where Claire was standing, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the sound wasn't already saying. Claire lowered her hand from her mouth. Her eyes were wet. "It worked," she said. "It worked," he said. "First try." "The work was good going in," he said. "The prep your father did, the carburetor Callie rebuilt. I just connected it all." "Stop doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Minimizing what you did." He thought about that for a second. She was right. He'd been doing it as a habit, a reflex against sounding like he was taking something that wasn't his to take. But she was right that it was a reflex, not an honest accounting. "Okay," he said. "It ran because the work was done right, and I did that work." "Yes," she said. "You did." Margaret had moved closer to the car. She was standing at the driver's door looking in, and one hand was resting on the roof. Not grasping, just touching, the way you touch something to confirm it's real. She stood there for a long time. Then she looked at Ethan. "What does it need?" she asked. Her voice was steady again, recovered, with only the slight rawness around the edges that emotion leaves when it's retreated. "Drive it," he said. "Not hard and not far the first time. Let everything seat properly, but it needs to be driven. These engines aren't meant to idle in garages." "Richard said the same thing," she said. "He said the car had been waiting long enough." He was right. She looked at the car again, then at Ethan, then at Claire, then at Maya, who she regarded with the same directness she gave everyone, and Maya regarded her back with the same. "Would your daughter like to hear it?" Margaret asked. Maya glanced at Ethan. "Go ahead," he said. Maya walked over to the car with the specific ceremony of a child who understands she's been given access to something important. She stood next to the open window and listened to the idle, her head tilted slightly, her face serious. "It sounds like it's breathing," she said. Margaret looked at her. "That's exactly what Richard said," she said quietly. Maya absorbed this. "What was he like?" she asked, with the directness that only children and people who've given up on pretense ever deploy. A pause. "He was honest," Margaret said. "He was patient in ways I wasn't. He knew how to slow down, and I'm still learning that." She paused again. "He would have liked you very much. He liked people who paid attention." Maya took this in with the gravity it deserved. Claire had come to stand beside Ethan, close enough that he was aware of her presence without it being anything more than presence. They stood watching Margaret and Maya at the car, the engine running between them. "She's never talked about him to a stranger," Claire said, barely above the engine. "Maya's not a stranger," Ethan said. "She's just direct." "Is that where she gets it?" He thought about his answer. "I try to be honest about things. She took it further than I did. She'll call something by its name when I'm still deciding whether to say it out loud." "I like that about her," Claire said. "Most people do," he said, "until she calls their thing by its name." Claire almost laughed. It was closer than usual. He let the engine run for 20 minutes, monitoring the temperature, listening to it settle. When he shut it off, the garage was quiet in the specific way it is when a sound has been present long enough that its absence is also a presence. Margaret straightened up from where she'd been leaning against the car. "I want to take it out before April," she said, "before the anniversary." She said it plainly, as a fact she'd decided. "Richard died in April. I'd like to take it out before then." "It'll be road ready in 2 weeks," Ethan said. "Registration and insurance, whatever the estate needs to do, that's your side." "I'll have that done this week." She paused. "I want Claire to drive it first." Claire looked at her mother. "He would have wanted that," Margaret said. "You were always his. You were more like him than either of you admitted." She said it with the particular difficulty of saying something true that has been overdue. "I was jealous of that once. Now I think it's a gift." Claire was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that happens when something lands somewhere it needed to land. "Okay," she said. "Yeah, okay." They stayed another hour. Someone from the house brought tea, and Maya declined tea and asked for water with the unapologetic specificity she brought to all preferences. Denise brought water and more of the cookies, because apparently Denise had understood something about Maya's relationship with those cookies. At some point, in the quiet of the garage with the tea cooling and the car sitting finished in its bay, Margaret sat on one of the stools and said to no one specifically, "I spent 3 years trying to protect everything at once. The company, Claire, the memory of him, all of it. And protecting everything meant trusting nothing." She paused. "The car was in here for 3 years and I couldn't come in." Nobody answered immediately. The garage held it. "The thing about trust," Ethan said eventually, not as a lecture, but as a thing he'd been thinking about, is that it's not actually about the other person at first. It's about deciding what kind of person you're going to be. The other person comes second. Margaret looked at him. I don't mean that to sound like a fortune cookie, he said. It doesn't, she said. It sounds like someone who's had to figure that out practically. I have a 7-year-old, he said. You figure out trust practically, or you figure it out wrong? How is it going? Claire asked. The shop? Really? Really? He considered. The fleet contract is going to change things structurally. It'll take 6 months before that's fully operational. In the meantime, the new visibility has helped. We've had more inquiries in the last 3 weeks than in the last 3 months before that. He paused. I'm going to hire 2 people from the trade program Darius knows. I'm looking at the building next to the shop. The owner's willing to talk about a lease expansion. The numbers work if the Ashford contract performs to the minimum volume guarantee. It will, Claire said. I know. That's not anxiety talking. It's planning. He set down his tea. My landlord is also now motivated to negotiate the renewal on my current space at something closer to actual market rate, because he read the article and understood that I have options he wasn't accounting for. Is that comfortable for you? Claire asked, using the story as leverage. It's not leverage, he said. It's just information. He knows the situation better now. Better information makes for better negotiations. He paused. My dad used to say the only unfair advantage is the one based on a lie. Truth is just the playing field. Smart man, Margaret said. Yeah, Ethan said. He was. The drive home was different from any of the other 90-minute drives he'd made on this road over the past 3 months. Maya was quieter than usual, which meant she was processing something rather than reporting on it. He let her process. About halfway home, she said, The car's starting. Why did that make them cry? He thought about how to answer that. Because it was something her husband, Claire's dad, started and never got to finish. And it was sitting there for 3 years, not running, and now it runs. So it's not just a car anymore, it's evidence of something. Evidence of what? That things can be finished, even when the person who started them isn't there. He drove for a moment. And that's hard to feel and good to feel at the same time. Maya thought about that. Like how you still teach me things Grandpa taught you, she said. He glanced at her. Like the tire changing, she said. You showed me the cross pattern. You said Grandpa taught you. He had shown her that last summer in the driveway on the truck's spare. He hadn't realized she'd made the connection to this. Yeah, he said, like that. She looked out the window. So it keeps going, she said, even when people stop. Yeah, he said. It keeps going. She nodded slowly and went back to looking at the fields. He drove. The week after was ordinary in the best way. He was at the shop by 7, managed 2 fleet trucks from the Columbus hub, helped Darius interview the 2 candidates from the trade program. Both of them good, one slightly better, and he told Darius to offer them both because the volume was coming and you didn't find reliable people twice. He called the building next door and arranged a walkthrough. He sent a short email to Renata Cole updating her on the Holt matter and asking where the DA's case stood. She replied that Holt's attorney had accepted a plea agreement, restitution, a substantial fine, and a suspended sentence contingent on no further violations. No prison, which Ethan had mixed feelings about, but a permanent record and a career in corporate America that was effectively over. He read Renata's email at the kitchen table in the morning before Maya woke up. The same table where he'd done the math 100 times, where he'd eaten cold soup, where he'd signed the contract. The table looked the same as it always had. The light came in the same. His coffee was the same temperature it always was at that hour, which was slightly less hot than he wanted, but he never remembered to account for the 2 minutes between pouring and sitting. He thought about what Maya had said in the car. So it keeps going, even when people stop. He'd been raised by a man who taught him things the way you're supposed to teach things. Not by instruction only, but by doing them, by being them, so that eventually you absorb them without knowing when the absorption happened. His father had stopped on a highway once, that he knew of, for a family with a broken-down van. He'd heard about it secondhand from his aunt, years after his father died. He'd never asked his father about it directly. He wondered sometimes if his father had almost kept driving. He probably had. That was the thing nobody talked about, how close the good decisions come to not being made. How many times the car almost doesn't stop. How many times the person almost doesn't speak up, almost doesn't trust, almost keeps their head down for one more year until keeping it down becomes the entire story. He'd almost kept driving on Route 9. He'd sat in his truck for a few seconds looking at those hazard lights in the rain, and he'd thought about Maya asleep on Mrs. Pacheco's couch, and his own cold dinner, and the transmission job he needed to get to in the morning. And then he'd gotten out. Not heroically, not even decisively, really. He'd just not kept driving, that was all. The smallest possible unit of action. And from that almost nothing, 3 months of complicated, difficult, real human life had happened. And an engine had started that hadn't run in 3 years, and a woman had said something true to her daughter that she'd been holding back since her husband died. And a 7-year-old had learned that sometimes things keep going even when the person who started them stops. The coffee got cold while he was thinking. He drank it anyway. Claire called him that Friday. Not about business. There was no business to discuss that week. But she called and he answered, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that weren't the Jaguar and weren't the contract and weren't the investigation. She was reading a book about the history of automotive design that she'd found on her father's shelf, and she described a passage about the E-Type's designer with the enthusiasm of someone who'd stumbled into a subject they hadn't expected to care about. He told her about a car he'd worked on years ago, a 1954 Hudson Hornet, that an elderly man had brought in for a simple tune-up, and Ethan had ended up spending 3 days on because it was extraordinary and the owner had been in no hurry. She laughed at the part where the owner had shown up at the end of day 2 with a grocery bag of food because he'd assumed Ethan hadn't eaten. "Had you eaten?" she asked. "Not since morning," he admitted. "What was in the bag?" "2 sandwiches and a 6-pack of RC Cola," he said. "It was a very specific kind of generosity." She laughed. He hadn't heard her laugh fully. Not the almost, not the adjacent thing, but actually laugh. And it was different from what he'd expected, unself-conscious in a way that her speaking voice never fully was. He didn't say anything about it. He just noted it as something that happened, that was real, that was part of what this had become. They didn't talk about what this was. They didn't need to that night. Some things are better understood by allowing them to exist before you name them, and both of them had spent enough of their lives either over-explaining or keeping too silent that the middle ground, when they found it, was something to stay in for a while. He drove to Granville one final time on a Saturday in mid-February, not to work but to take the rest of his tools. The garage was empty without the Jaguar, which Claire had moved into one of the main bays of the larger attached garage now that it was road-ready. Ethan stood in the restoration bay for a moment and looked at the space, the workbench where Richard Ashford's notepad had sat, the stool he'd sat on, the faint outline of oil on the floor from some job he'd done in November that hadn't fully cleaned up. He left it cleaner than he'd found it, which was what you did. On the way out, he stopped at the covered walkway. Claire was there, leaning against the door frame, her coat on, like she'd been waiting to catch him before he left. "You don't have to make it a goodbye," she said. "I'm not. You have the contract. You'll be back for fleet meetings." "I know." She looked at him. "You look like you're trying to land somewhere." "Maybe," he said. "It's a lot to take in. The whole thing." She nodded slowly. "What's the part that you keep coming back to?" He thought about it honestly. "That I almost didn't stop," he said. "That whole story, everything that happened. It was an inch away from not happening. I sat in my truck for maybe 15 seconds, and I almost talked myself out of it." "But you didn't." "But I didn't." He looked at her. "That's the part I think about. Not the stuff that came after, just those 15 seconds." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you didn't," she said. "Me too," he said. She pushed off the door frame and walked out through the covered walkway beside him, and they stood for a moment in the cold February air outside the garage with the pale sky overhead and the property spreading out around them, the bare maples along the drive, the frost on the grass beginning to lift. "Drive safe," she said. "I always do," he said. He loaded the last of his tools in the truck and drove back to Millhaven. The shop was open when he got there. Darius had the lights on and 2 bays occupied, and the new hire, a woman named Sue Min, with extraordinarily clean technique and a habit of annotating her work orders more thoroughly than anyone had asked her to, was working on an alternator with the focused quiet of someone who'd found the right place for what she was good at. He stood in the bay door for a minute and looked at his shop. It wasn't different from the outside. The sign was still faded. The parking lot gravel still had the same low spots where water pooled when it rained. The bay doors still needed weather stripping on the bottom that he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. But inside, the numbers were different. The calendar on the wall had jobs scheduled 3 weeks out. Darius had developed a system for the fleet intake paperwork that was better than anything Ethan had designed. The second bay he'd cleared for expansion had 2 lifts on order. He walked in. "How was it?" Darius asked from under a Jeep. "Good," Ethan said. "Car done?" "Car's done." "Did it run?" "First try," Ethan said. Darius slid out from under the Jeep and looked at him from the floor. "For real?" "First try," Ethan said. Darius lay there for a second, looking at the ceiling. "That's satisfying," he said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "It really is." He hung up his jacket and poured coffee and went back to work. Sumin had a question about the alternator's charge rate, and he answered it. There was a voicemail from the Zanesville Logistics Company, and he called them back. There was a transmission estimate he'd been meaning to write up, and he wrote it. Ordinary things. The specific weight of a life that had found its level. That night, at home, Maya showed him the latest iteration of her volcanic activity tracking project, which had expanded to include a hand-drawn global map with colored pins and a legend she'd designed herself and a timeline going back 6 months. It covered 3 pages taped together on the kitchen table and was genuinely impressive in its scope and attention to detail. He studied it for a while. She stood next to him, explaining the system, and he listened the way he always listened to her, not waiting for her to finish so he could speak, but actually following the logic, asking the questions that were real questions. "This is good," he said. "This is actually good work." She looked at it. "I know," she said, without false modesty, which was one of his favorite things about her. "I think I want to be a geologist. You wanted to be a volcanologist last month." "Geologists study volcanoes," she said patiently. "It's more options." He nodded. "Smart." She went to get ready for bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the map in front of him, all those colored pins representing things happening deep in the earth, pressure building and releasing and building again, the planet doing what the planet does without asking anyone's permission. He thought about a tire on a wet highway in the dark, about 3 words written on the back of a business card, about a woman pee's hand on a car roof, confirming it was real, about an engine catching on the 3rd compression and finding its idle and staying there. He thought about his father, who had taught him the cross pattern for lug nuts, and also, without meaning to teach it, the thing that mattered more. That you stop. That you get out. That you don't leave the deciding to someone else and call it practicality. He didn't know if that was wisdom or just stubbornness arranged to look like wisdom from a certain angle. He suspected the 2 things were closer together than most people admitted. What he knew was simpler. One cold November night, he'd been tired and behind, and he'd almost kept driving, and instead he'd changed a tire, and then told the truth when the truth was expensive, and then done the work when the work was in front of him, and those 3 things, none of them remarkable on their own, had turned out to be enough. Not enough to fix everything, not enough to make the world different in any large way, but enough to matter to the people they mattered to, enough to start an engine that had been silent 3 years. Enough to give his daughter a father who breathed a little easier at the end of a day. Enough to give a woman her own voice back. Enough to let a mother finally, carefully, begin to trust what she felt rather than only what she could protect. Enough was enough. He turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Maya, who was already asleep with a library book open on the pillow next to her. Something about tectonic plates, the bookmark 3/4 through. He moved the book to the nightstand and turned off her lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside, February was doing what February does. Cold, dark, indifferent. The world exactly as complicated as it had always been. He went to bed. In the morning, there would be work, and the work would be good, and that was more than enough to start with.